Geoffrey Hill stepped out of his rented black sedan onto Westport's Main Street, taking in a slow breath of crisp morning air. It had been 6 years since he last set foot in this small Connecticut town, an eternity by his relentless, city-paced standards. Dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and polished loafers, he felt more than ever like a visitor to a past he had long ago tried to forget. Even the sound of the wind rustling through the elm trees felt distant, as if taunting him for thinking he could slip in without stirring memories. He closed the car door and checked his watch, a habit he had developed after countless 14-hour workdays. Hill Tech Solutions, his tech empire in Manhattan, ran like clockwork, and Geoffrey prided himself on keeping it that way. The entire trip to Westport was meant to be an in-and-out affair, sign the inheritance papers for his late Uncle Edward's estate, and vanish before anyone noticed. Yet, as he surveyed the familiar storefronts, places he and his ex-wife once visited, an uneasy feeling formed in his chest. Following the steady rhythm of his polished steps, he approached the old bookstore at the corner. A fleeting memory of browsing paperbacks with Francis flashed through his mind. In the reflection of the store window, he noticed a woman about 20 feet away, standing near the local bakery. She was slight in build, with chestnut-brown hair catching the morning light. She turned slightly, and her face came into clear view. There was no doubt Francis Reynolds, or rather Francis Hill, once upon a time. A knot formed in his stomach at the sight of her. He hadn't expected to see her so soon, if at all. Beside her stood a small boy, perhaps 5 years old, sporting a mischievous grin as he chatted with his mother. His hair stuck up in a stubborn cowlick that made Geoffrey's pulse quicken. He recognized that swirl because it had been the bane of his own childhood. The child laughed at something Francis said, then turned halfway. In that moment, Geoffrey caught a glimpse of the boy's piercing green eyes, his eyes. It was like looking at his younger reflection, and a rush of dizziness washed over him. He paused mid-step, the noise of passing cars fading into an indistinct hum. His mind began tallying the years. The boy looked close to 5. 6 years ago, Geoffrey had left Westport in a swirl of financial ruin and a shattered marriage. If Frances had become pregnant before he left, the timing fit uncomfortably well. His breath caught in his throat. He realized, with a certainty that felt almost mathematical, that he was looking at his son, something he never imagined possible. A swirl of regret, confusion, and shock collided in his chest, threatening the steel composure he had worked so hard to cultivate in Manhattan. As if sensing the disturbance, Frances looked up and locked eyes with him. Her face went pale, and her expression was guarded, almost accusatory. Geoffrey took a hesitant step forward, his entire body tingling with a mix of longing and dread. He remembered exactly why he had sworn never to return. Westport was the site of his deepest failures. Bankruptcy had taken every dollar he had, and a bitter divorce from Frances had felt like the final nail in his coffin. Back then, he was nothing but a broken man with big dreams that had crumbled. He left to escape the humiliation, building an empire in Manhattan piece by piece, telling himself he owed no one an explanation. Now, the past stood right before him in the form of a wide-eyed child who might bear his name. Frances pulled the boy gently behind her, as if shielding him from this sudden apparition. Geoffrey fought the urge to flee. Instead, he lifted a trembling hand in a half-wave. The boy peered around Frances's arm, curiosity shining in those vivid green eyes. Steeling himself, Geoffrey approached, feeling as though he were walking on a tightrope. He attempted a smile, though it wavered with uncertainty. Frances's lips pressed into a firm line. He recognized the hurt and resentment in her gaze. He wanted to say a million things, but no words came out. Instead, he simply stared at the boy, now quiet under his mother's watchful stare. Behind the child, a slice of Jeffrey's old life flickered, an echo of the hopes and dreams he once held when he first married Frances. He remembered lazy Saturdays spent driving the winding roads around the lake house, Uncle Edward calling after him to help fix the old dock, and the faint thrill of believing in a future full of promise. How had he become so consumed with success that he'd blotted out all possibility of a family? He wanted to ask Frances something, anything that would confirm what he already knew, but before he found his voice, she stepped back, tightening her hold on the child's hand. In her expression lay a complicated mixture of fear, anger, and sorrow. She turned and walked briskly in the opposite direction, leaving Jeffrey rooted to the spot, heart pounding in his chest. When she disappeared around the corner, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket, where he kept a folded photograph, a relic he stumbled upon while packing for this trip. It was his old wedding picture with Frances, taken on a sunlit afternoon where they both believed anything was possible. Staring at her smiling face, he felt the weight of all he'd run from and the life he might have missed. Nothing in Manhattan's skyscrapers or Hiltech's boardrooms had prepared him for this moment. Nothing at all. Later that day, Jeffrey found himself pacing the length of a modest conference room at Patterson & Sons, the law firm handling Uncle Edward's estate. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the scent of old leather and floor polish hung in the air. He tried to steady his breathing, still rattled by the morning's revelation on Main Street. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and in walked Frances, shoulders stiff and gaze unwavering. Her presence cut through the stale air like a current of electricity. She was dressed simply, jeans and a navy sweater, but there was a quiet dignity in her posture that made Jeffrey feel more underdressed than any $1,000 suit could. For several seconds, neither spoke. Jeffrey's heart thudded in his ears as he searched for some opening line. What did one say to the wife he'd left behind, now the mother of a child he hadn't known existed? Frances broke the silence. "You're here for Edward's inheritance, aren't you?" Her tone was calm on the surface, but carried a sharp undercurrent. Jeffrey swallowed, then nodded. "Yes, he passed away a few days ago. I got a call from his attorney. Apparently, Edward, left me the lake house and other assets. I didn't know until last week." Frances's eyes flashed. "Strange how that news finds you immediately, but none of my letters, calls, or emails ever reached you, right?" He felt a surge of defensive anger, but tamped it down. "I honestly had no idea about our son." His voice trembled at the words, making it sound almost foreign. "I shut out everything from Westport after I left. I blocked calls, changed my address, my email." She cut him off. "I tried everything. You hired gatekeepers who told me you wouldn't speak to me. I left messages with your assistant. I even took a bus to your Manhattan office twice when I was pregnant, hoping to catch you in the lobby. Do you have any idea how humiliating that was?" Jeffrey felt the sting of her words. He thought back to those early days in Manhattan, when every memory of Westport felt like a burden he couldn't afford. I'm sorry," he managed. Her shoulders sagged under the weight of the conversation. "That child you saw today is named Sean. He's 5. He's in kindergarten now. And he's smart. So smart he sometimes makes my head spin. And he's been asking questions about his dad." Jeffrey closed his eyes, feeling an ache behind them. He pictured the boy's bright green eyes, that cowlick so much like his own. Does he even know I exist?" Frances hesitated, arms crossed protectively. "He knows his father left after a big fight, but I didn't give him any details. I told him you were gone for work. I didn't know what else to say. How do you explain abandonment to a toddler?" A heavy quiet filled the room. Jeffrey's mind raced back to the day he left town, heavy with debt and desperation. His departure was fueled by shame. He never envisioned fatherhood, certainly never considered the possibility that Frances could have been pregnant. "I never meant to abandon—" She let out a bitter laugh. "But you did, Geoffrey. I wrote you letters, sent certified mail. Your Uncle Edward knew. He tried to tell you more than once, I'm sure. But you'd already decided everyone in Westport was part of your old life, the one you wanted to forget." A wave of guilt coursed through him. Uncle Edward had always been the one link to this town that Geoffrey might have kept, yet he'd been so resolute about leaving it all behind that he must have ignored anything Edward tried to say. Before he could gather a coherent defense, the door opened again. Richard Patterson, the attorney, stepped in, his weathered face lined with concern. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said quietly. "But I thought you both should know that there are matters regarding Edward's estate that directly concern Sean's future." Frances bit her lip, sending a wary glance in Geoffrey's direction. "Does that mean money earmarked for Sean?" Richard nodded. "Among other things, Edward made specific arrangements. He was quite concerned about the boy. And you, Geoffrey. He believed you needed to step up. Though it wasn't his place to force the issue while he was alive, Geoffrey felt his throat tighten. In his mind, he saw Uncle Edward's kind eyes and gruff voice, always telling him to appreciate what truly mattered. What would Edward think of him now? Frances exhaled slowly, her eyes reflecting a torrent of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, maybe even relief at finally speaking the truth. "So," she said at last, "what do you plan to do about any of this? Because I won't let you swoop in and disrupt Sean's life if you're not going to stay." He didn't know how to answer. The only thing he knew for certain was that his polished life in Manhattan suddenly felt hollow compared to the reality of a child who shared his face. He stared at Frances, realizing that any response he gave now would shape all their lives. But words failed him, and all he could do was stand there, acutely aware that his world had just shifted forever. That night, Geoffrey booked a room at the Westport Inn on the outskirts of town, too shaken to stay at the old lake house he now legally owned. He needed space, physical and mental, to absorb the shock. Despite the inn's cozy ambience, with its worn plaid couches and soft yellow lighting, he felt colder than if he'd been standing outside in the brisk evening air. He paced the length of the small room, phone in hand. His assistant, Victoria Chang, had left 3 voicemails marked urgent, each about pressing matters at Hill Tech. Usually, he would have dropped everything to handle such emergencies, but tonight he stared at the screen, unmoving. His mind kept drifting to the image of that small boy with the green eyes, a boy who should have been part of his life all along. Hours crept by. The incessant hum of the air conditioner only heightened his restlessness. Finally, unable to bear the silence, he tossed on a jacket and headed out. The moon cast a silver glow on the quiet streets. Even at this hour, Westport seemed hauntingly familiar. Rows of clapboard houses with manicured lawns, the faint scent of wood smoke, and a distant train whistle that reminded him of the night he'd left for New York years ago. He wandered past the law office of Patterson and Sons, where he'd faced Frances earlier. In the soft glow of a street lamp, he caught a glimpse of light from within. His curiosity piqued. He stepped closer and peered through a side window. There was Richard Patterson, hunched over a desk, reading by a dim lamp. Next to him stood a younger woman, her hair in a neat bun, flipping through papers with a frustrated expression. Geoffrey recognized her from high school, Emma Patterson. They both appeared engrossed in documents, perhaps related to Uncle Edward's estate. Tempted to walk away, he hesitated as the front door suddenly opened. Emma stepped outside, startled to see him lingering there. She studied him for a moment, her expression a mixture of annoyance and pity. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked quietly, not unkindly. "Not really," he admitted. "I didn't expect anyone to still be here," she shrugged, nodding toward the interior. "My dad and I have a lot of paperwork to finalize. Your uncle left a pretty complicated will. He had strong feelings about you, and about Sean." Just hearing his son's name made Jeffrey's chest tighten. "I'm sure he did." Emma's gaze was unwavering. "He tried to reach you multiple times. Dad told me how Edward sent letters and made phone calls. It's all documented. He wanted you to know about your son." Jeffrey swallowed hard. I must have blocked it all out. I told my team to keep me away from everything Westport related." Emma's tone sharpened. "That's an understatement. Frances came here twice, pregnant, hoping someone could help her. Uncle Edward tried to intervene, but you were unreachable." She paused, a hint of something like empathy creeping into her voice. "Look, I'm not trying to vilify you. It's just the truth." He nodded, at a loss for words. How could he explain the desperation he'd felt, or how thoroughly he'd banished Westport from his life? Every reminder of this place had been a reminder of his failure, bankruptcy, lost love, the humiliation of returning to a town that watched him burn out. Emma sighed, looking down at her watch. "It's late, and Dad and I still have plenty to do. Tomorrow, come by. We'll go over the estate details, but honestly, you might want to talk to Frances again first." Jeffrey managed a quick nod, then watched her slip back inside. He stood there for another moment, hearing the murmur of voices through the door. The magnitude of what he had done, what he had missed, fell on him like a heavy cloak. He walked back to the inn, replaying his memories. The day he left, Uncle Edward's stern voice telling him not to run from his problems, his own vow never to let a small-town failure define him again. It struck him how ironically he had fulfilled that vow by becoming a huge success in the city, yet he'd traded away the chance to see his son take his first steps or learn his first words. Once inside his room, he flipped open his laptop to find an email from Richard Patterson. Attached were scanned copies of certified letters sent to him years ago, proof that his uncle had tried repeatedly to inform him of Sean's birth. Emotions crashed over him like a storm. How many times had he disregarded or deleted these warnings as he scrambled to build his empire? In a box next to the email, there was a photograph, a grainy shot of a little boy fishing off the lake house dock. Sean. In the background, Edward's proud profile was visible. Jeffrey could almost hear the old man's gravelly voice instructing the boy to keep the line steady. He closed the laptop, heart pounding. The image was too raw to bear. Thoughts of running back to Manhattan warred with a new instinct, a primal urge to stay. The alternative was to abandon the boy again, and this time there could be no excuse of ignorance. He turned off the light and stared at the dark ceiling, knowing he wouldn't sleep. He'd built a fortune, but for the first time in his life, he questioned whether any of it mattered in the face of this unfolding truth. Jeffrey awoke the next morning with a dull ache behind his eyes and the taste of stale coffee in his mouth. After a restless night, he finally decided to take the next step. Rather than heading straight to Patterson and Sons, he drove to the lake house, his inheritance. It was a sprawling wooden home set by a peaceful lake, ringed by tall trees that filtered the sun into golden patches on the water. He climbed out of the car and stood on the gravel driveway, memories jostling for attention. As a boy, he'd spent lazy summers here with Uncle Edward, learning to fish off the rickety dock, reading old books in the sunroom, and dreaming of the big world beyond Westport. Now, the place felt like a museum of his past. He unlocked the front door and stepped inside, noting the faint smell of cedar and dust. The furniture had been covered with sheets, preserving the space in a kind of time capsule. He wandered from room to room, his footfalls echoing on the hardwood floors. Before long, he came upon a tidy kitchen where Mrs. Abernathy, the caretaker, was busy washing dishes. She was a petite woman in her early 70s, hair pinned neatly at the back of her head, and a warmth about her that set him momentarily at ease. "Geoffrey," she greeted, wiping her hands on a towel. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." "Mrs. Abernathy," he replied, attempting a smile. "I appreciate you looking after this place. I'm sorry it's been so long." She studied him with a motherly concern. "You always were on the move, dear." "Edward worried about you, but he was proud too. He mentioned you built quite the company in the city. Shame he never got the chance to speak with you more about it." Geoffrey cleared his throat, trying not to show how her words cut him. "He tried," he said softly. "I just wouldn't listen." Mrs. Abernathy gave a gentle nod, then placed a large envelope on the counter. "He left a few things for you, even before the official will was drawn up. Said you might want to see these." She turned to rinse another dish, giving Geoffrey the space to open the envelope in private. Inside, he found letters and photographs. One letter was still sealed, addressed to him in Francis's handwriting, dated nearly 6 years ago. His hands shook as he opened it. Francis's words leapt off the page, describing her realization that she was pregnant, her fear that he would shut her out, and her faint hope he might change his mind about leaving. The letter ended with a simple plea. "Please come back, even if it's just to talk. I don't want to raise our child alone." He set the letter down, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. If only he'd read this at the time. If only he hadn't been so determined to erase every connection to Westport. A wave of self-recrimination hit him like a punch to the gut. For the rest of the morning, he sifted through the photographs. Many were of Sean at various ages, newborn, toddler, preschooler, none of which Geoffrey had ever seen. There were even a couple of distant shots of the boy fishing at the community pier. Uncle Edward had apparently taken those pictures in secret, then carefully labeled them by date. The proof was irrefutable. Edward had known, and he had cared, documenting Sean's life to fill the gap Geoffrey had left. The sound of Geoffrey's phone broke the hush. He glanced at the caller ID, Victoria Chang. Normally, he'd answer immediately, prepared to tackle whatever crisis threatened Hilltech, but now the phone only reminded him of a life that no longer felt so certain. He silenced it, exhaling shakily. Mrs. Abernathy appeared at his side, placing a cup of tea on the table. "You've got that look your uncle had when he was deep in thought," she remarked. "You know, he once told me he was waiting for the day you'd come back and make things right, not just with him, but with the town and yourself." Geoffrey stared at the steam rising from the teacup. "He knew about Sean, didn't he?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "Yes. Saw that little boy around town." Edward's eyes lit up whenever he got the chance to mention him. He was proud of that boy, though he never overstepped his boundaries with Francis. "Guess he thought you two would work it out in time." At the mention of Francis, Geoffrey felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Anger at her for not finding a way to get through to him, anger at himself for making it impossible for her to do so, and an overriding sense of loss. He closed the folder of photographs, resolved to face what lay before him. Before leaving, he took one last look around the house. This was no longer a relic of his past, but possibly a bridge to his future, a place where he might get to know his son, if Francis would allow it. As he stepped back onto the porch, the crisp lake air filled his lungs, mingling with a hope he barely dared to acknowledge. On the third day of his return, Geoffrey found himself parked on a quiet residential street just outside Francis's small, well-kept home. It was late afternoon, and the golden glow of the sun made the painted shutters on her house look almost picturesque. He'd been sitting in his car for nearly an hour, gathering his courage, reminding himself that no hostile boardroom takeover or high-stakes negotiation had ever felt this daunting. He gripped the steering wheel, eyes flickering between the front door and the windows. Through one of them, he could see Francis moving about the kitchen. Occasionally, a small head with that unmistakable cowlick bobbed into view. Sean. Jeffrey's heart pounded at the realization that this was his son's life. Cereal bowls in the sink, toys scattered on the living room floor, cartoons humming faintly in the background. A life that had been unfolding without him. His phone vibrated again. Marcus Walsh. Jeffrey grimaced, remembering the string of missed calls. Marcus was his longtime business partner, the one who stood by him when Hilltech was just an idea scrawled on a cocktail napkin. Nowadays, Marcus had his own troubles, trying to balance work and caring for his wife, who had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia last year. Jeffrey couldn't ignore him forever, yet he also couldn't tear himself away from the scene before him. For the first time in his adult life, business seemed secondary. Suddenly, the front door opened. Frances stepped onto the porch, searching the street with a wary gaze. She spotted Jeffrey's sleek sedan and froze, her expression revealing both surprise and exasperation. He took that as his cue to exit the car, though his legs felt like lead. Each step toward her chipped away at the invisible wall he had constructed around himself. She descended the porch steps, arms folded across her chest. "You've been out here a while. I saw you pull up earlier," she said, her tone guarded. Jeffrey managed a faint smile. "I was trying to figure out what to say." She raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at the house. "Sean's inside. My mother has him occupied with coloring books. She doesn't want him seeing you yet, not without my say-so." Hearing that, Jeffrey swallowed hard. "I understand. I want to talk about what happens now, with us and with Sean." He paused, struggling to piece his words together. "I'm still trying to process that I have a son. I didn't know, Frances. I swear to you." Her shoulders stiffened. "I believe that you didn't know, but I also believe you made it impossible to find out. You left Westport as if it were on fire, and you burnt every bridge on your way out." He nodded, accepting her anger. "I know. I was in a bad place back then. I'd lost everything. Our business was bankrupt. Our marriage was in shambles, and I felt like I had nothing. Leaving felt like my only escape." Frances's features softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "I get it. But that doesn't change the fact that Sean's grown up without a father. He's old enough to ask questions now, and I don't know how to answer them in a way that won't break his heart." Jeffrey ran a hand through his hair, glancing toward the window again. "I want to be part of his life," he said quietly. "I'm not here on a whim. I don't plan to leave tomorrow. Marcus has been trying to get me back to Manhattan for days, but I'm not going until I figure this out." Frances studied him, trying to discern if his determination was genuine. Slowly, she exhaled. "If that's true, then we need to set some ground rules. Sean's my priority. I can't have you coming in and out of his life as it suits you." "I understand," Jeffrey replied, "and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. If you want me to see him only with you present, I'll do that. If you don't want me around at all, I'll leave you two in peace." The last words caught in his throat, but he forced them out. He had to show he respected her decisions. Frances was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He knows he has a father, but he thinks you've just been away for work. He doesn't understand what divorce really means. He's too young. I've tried to protect him from the hurt." Jeffrey nodded, recalling how he felt at the law office when she'd explained her attempts to contact him. "He deserves the truth, but only when you think he's ready." She gazed at him, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You're going to have to earn his trust and mine. It's not something that can be fixed overnight." A soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Jeffrey realized this might be the most important negotiation of his life. He looked at Frances, the woman who once believed in him wholeheartedly. "I will," he promised, voice unsteady with emotion. "I'm not going anywhere this time." They stood there under the fading sunlight, neither one quite sure what came next. But for the first time since he set foot in Westport, Geoffrey felt the faint stirrings of hope. He had a son. He had a chance, albeit a fragile one, to be a father and maybe, just maybe, to atone for the years he'd lost. The next morning, Geoffrey stood on Francis's front porch, summoning the courage to knock. He had hardly slept after their conversation by the car, replaying her every word in his mind. Now he could hear voices inside, Francis speaking in a raised tone, another voice older and sharper. When he finally rapped on the door, it swung open almost immediately. Margaret Reynolds, Francis's mother, filled the doorway. She was in her late 50s, her once dark hair lightly threaded with silver. In her steady gaze, Geoffrey saw little warmth. "I was wondering when you'd show your face," Margaret said, crossing her arms. "Francis mentioned you'd be coming by." From inside, Francis emerged, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. She sent Margaret a cautious glance, then looked at Geoffrey. "Come in," she said quietly. "Let's talk." Margaret held her ground for a moment longer before stepping aside with a disapproving frown. Geoffrey moved past her into the living room, feeling the weight of her scrutiny. The cozy space was dotted with evidence of a small child: toy cars, crayons, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. Sean's presence was everywhere, and Geoffrey's chest constricted at the thought that he had been absent from all of it. Francis motioned for him to sit on a worn armchair. She settled onto the couch, while Margaret stood near the window, arms folded in silent judgment. The pressure in the room was palpable. "I won't mince words," Margaret said finally, her gaze fixed on Geoffrey. "You broke my daughter's heart and walked away from your responsibilities. Now you show up as if you've just discovered conscience. Why should we trust you?" Geoffrey swallowed hard. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I just need a chance to prove I'm not the same man who left Westport." He turned to Francis. "I want to be involved in Sean's life. I'd do anything to make that happen." Francis's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "I believe you didn't know about Sean, Geoffrey, but it doesn't erase the past. Mom's been here to help with everything while I went back to school and found work. She's seen me through tears and hospital trips and birthdays with an empty chair meant for you." Margaret let out a breath. "He's my grandson, and I'd do anything for him. So if you are sincere, I expect to see you doing more than making promises." Geoffrey nodded. "Of course. I'd like to start by spending time with him, carefully, on your terms." Francis pressed her lips together. "He doesn't know you're his father, not yet. I told you before, I've been saying his dad is working far away, to spare him confusion. I don't want to uproot his world all at once." A sudden knock sounded on the half-open front door, interrupting the tense conversation. Richard Patterson, Uncle Edward's longtime attorney, peered in. He'd evidently come straight from his office, wearing a slightly rumpled suit and an apologetic smile. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I got your message, Francis," he said. His gaze flicked between the three of them, noting the strained atmosphere. Francis gestured for him to come in. "We were just discussing Sean and next steps," Richard nodded. "Geoffrey, I think we should talk about your uncle's estate soon. But before we do, allow me to say this. Edward believed you might return. He told me on more than one occasion that people can change if they truly want to. I suspect that's what Francis and Margaret are waiting to see." Margaret sniffed quietly, unwilling to concede that point, but she said nothing. Instead, she moved aside so Richard could join them. "Just know," she said, fixing Geoffrey with a stern look, "you get one chance. If you disappear again, I'll do whatever it takes to protect Sean." Under that intense scrutiny, Geoffrey felt both humbled and determined. "I understand," he replied. "This is my fault. I can't ask you to forgive me right away, but please, let me try to be a father to him." Francis exchanged a glance with her mother, then sighed. Let's start small. I'll allow you to see him, but only in supervised settings, like the park or with me here at home. And for now, we'll keep the truth about you being his father quiet until I see how Sean reacts to you." Jeffrey nodded, relief flooding through him. It was more than he deserved, but it was a beginning. Margaret still looked displeased, though she gave a curt nod, as if granting him a provisional pass. Richard cleared his throat. "If that's settled for the moment, Jeffrey, I'd like you to stop by my office next week. We can finalize some estate paperwork. Edward left instructions about what should be done for Sean's future, and it's important we handle those details." Before Jeffrey could answer, a small voice echoed from down the hallway. "Mom, is everything okay?" Sean peeked around the corner, holding a coloring pencil. His gaze landed on Jeffrey, curious but calm. Jeffrey's heart pounded. Here stood the child who bore so many of his traits, from the unruly hair to the inquisitive stare. Frances offered a reassuring smile. "Everything's fine, sweetheart." She turned to Jeffrey. "This is Mr. Hill," she said, choosing her words with care. "He's an old friend who's come back to visit Westport." Sean regarded Jeffrey with open curiosity. "Hi," he said simply. Jeffrey's throat tightened. He wanted to say so much, but all he managed was, "Hello, Sean." The moment felt charged, as if the air had thickened. He was introducing himself to his own son like a distant acquaintance. Margaret cleared her throat, and Frances placed a gentle hand on Sean's shoulder. "Why don't you show Mr. Hill your art?" Frances suggested. "We can visit with him for a few minutes before dinner." Sean nodded eagerly, disappearing again into the hallway. As Jeffrey rose to follow, he felt Margaret's eyes on his back. He understood the magnitude of this chance and how easily it could slip through his fingers. Stepping into the hallway, he braced himself for the smallest steps that might lead to something greater: acceptance, trust, and perhaps a path toward being the father Sean deserved. For the next week, Jeffrey's life revolved around short, carefully orchestrated visits. Each time he arrived at Frances's home or the local playground, Sean greeted him politely, more as a guest than a friend. Jeffrey understood Frances's caution. She never left them entirely alone, instead watching from a short distance, ready to step in. One late afternoon, Jeffrey met them at a small park in the center of town. The sprawling green lawn was dotted with children playing tag, while parents exchanged neighborly small talk on benches. Sean knelt in the grass near the jungle gym, scribbling in a notebook as he observed a line of ants. Jeffrey kneeled beside him. "What are you working on?" he asked gently, maintaining a respectful distance. Sean lifted his head, eyes bright. "I'm drawing them," he said, pointing at the ants. "They look so busy. It's like they have little roads and tunnels underground." Jeffrey smiled, amazed at how the boy's mind gravitated toward observation and structure. "They do. Ants are organized, kind of like a city, with all these different jobs and places to go." Sean's face lit up. "Yes. Mom says I should become a scientist or maybe an inventor." Warmth spread through Jeffrey's chest. It was as if he were seeing a reflection of himself at that age, always curious, always tinkering. He fought the urge to tell Sean how much they had in common. "Well, you can be anything you set your mind to," Jeffrey offered instead. Frances approached, her expression measured, though a hint of softness touched her features. "You ready for some ice cream, buddy?" she asked Sean, ruffling his hair. He jumped to his feet and nodded vigorously. Frances turned to Jeffrey. "We usually grab cones at the stand by the fountain," she said. "If you want to join us." He sensed the offer was a guarded extension of trust and seized it. "That sounds great." As they walked, a couple of curious onlookers nodded politely at Frances and Sean, then eyed Jeffrey. He recognized the same wariness he'd felt in Margaret's gaze. Word traveled fast in a small town. Everyone knew Francis had an ex-husband who vanished. Now he was back, and no one was quite sure how to feel about it. Still, Jeffrey and Sean chatted easily about ants and inventions all the way to the ice cream stand. Francis listened quietly, occasionally stepping in to guide the conversation, ensuring it never drifted too close to the truth. When Sean ran ahead to watch the cones being made, she turned to Jeffrey. "He's warming up to you," she said softly. "I notice how he looks at you when you talk about the things he loves. It's a start." Jeffrey nodded, swallowing a lump in his throat. "I'm grateful you're giving me this chance." "It must be hard for you." Francis's eyes flicked to Sean, now admiring the rainbow sprinkles behind the glass. "Hard doesn't begin to cover it, but I do see your effort, and Sean, he's such a bright kid. He deserves a father who actually wants to be here." A pang of remorse tightened Jeffrey's chest. "I do want to be here," he said, voice earnest. "I plan on staying as long as it takes." Before Francis could reply, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, frowned and excused herself. Jeffrey stepped closer to Sean, who was studying the ice cream menu. The boy turned with an enthusiastic grin. "Mom lets me get chocolate sometimes, but she says it's too much sugar if I have it twice in a week." Jeffrey chuckled. "Chocolate's my favorite, too, but yeah, too much of it can be—" He broke off when he saw Francis's alarmed expression as she ended her call. She rushed over to them, phone clenched in her hand. I have to head home," she stammered. "My mother needs me. Something urgent came up." Worry laced her tone, and Jeffrey stepped forward. "Is there anything I can do?" Her gaze flicked between him and Sean. "No, I'll handle it, but I'll have to cut this short." He nodded, disappointed but understanding. "Can I walk you two home?" Sean looked up, brow furrowed. "Are you okay, Mom?" She offered a reassuring smile to him. "Yes, honey, Grandma just needs my help with something." They made the short trek back in tense silence. Once at their doorstep, Francis turned to Jeffrey. "I'm sorry about this. We can arrange another time soon." Jeffrey dipped his head. "Don't worry, I understand. Take care." As he walked away, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Another call from Hilltech. These days, calls and messages from Manhattan felt like intrusions on a life he was no longer certain he wanted. Since news of his absence spread, rumors of a possible hostile takeover had grown louder. Marcus, his business partner, was doing everything he could to keep the company stable, but his messages hinted at the urgency for Jeffrey to return. He sighed, looking back at Francis's house. For so long, he believed leaving Westport was the best decision he ever made. Yet now, every moment he spent here felt more vital than any board meeting or corporate crisis. He couldn't shake the sensation that if he left again, if he abandoned Sean now, he might lose the chance for good. Pulling out his phone, he tapped out a quick message to Victoria, instructing her to gather all the urgent files and overnight them to Westport. He would handle as much business as he could from here for as long as he had to. He owed his son that much. That Saturday morning, Jeffrey pulled into the gravel parking lot of Westport's central playground, a space filled with swing sets, slides, and bright murals painted along a fence. Francis's text had been brief. "Meet us at the park at 10. Sean wants to show you something." He spotted Francis and Sean by a set of newly installed swings. The boy was balancing precariously on one swing seat, peering at the mechanical joint at the top, as if trying to figure out how it all worked. Francis hovered nearby, calling out gentle reminders for him to be careful. Jeffrey approached, and Sean waved enthusiastically. "Look at this design, Mr. Hill!" the boy exclaimed, tapping the metal structure. "They changed the way it's hooked on the chain. See how it moves." He crouched beside the swing, examining the joint. "That's clever," he said, noticing a small rotating piece that prevented the chain from twisting too much. "Prevents tangles, right?" Sean nodded. "Exactly. I'm going to try to build something like this at home, but smaller, maybe for my toy box. Frances, arms folded against the cool breeze, gave Geoffrey a quiet smile. He's been talking about this new swing assembly for days, she explained. Wanted to bring you here first thing. Geoffrey returned the smile, silently marveling at how a simple piece of playground equipment could captivate his son's imagination. I'm glad you brought me, he said. I wouldn't have noticed half these details on my own. They spent the next hour strolling around the playground, Sean excitedly guiding Geoffrey through the monkey bars, the tire swing, and the climbing wall. Each new station revealed more of the boy's inquisitive nature, stoking Geoffrey's pride and regret in equal measure. He couldn't help but wonder if he had also possessed that relentless curiosity as a child, and whether his father ever noticed. In the midst of their exploration, Sean spotted his friend Tyler, a freckle-faced boy about the same age, playing tag. Tyler ran over, out of breath, followed by his father, James, a broad-shouldered man in a casual flannel shirt. James offered a polite nod to Frances. "Morning, Frances," he said, catching his breath. He turned to Geoffrey, extending a firm hand. "I don't believe we've met. James Peterson." Geoffrey accepted the handshake. "Geoffrey Hill, nice to meet you." James regarded him with reserved curiosity, clearly aware of some tension he couldn't quite place. Sean tugged on Tyler's sleeve, wanting to dash off to the slides. Meanwhile, the two adults made awkward small talk. James was a local physician, well-liked around town, and had known Frances and Sean for some time. It struck Geoffrey that James seemed to fit seamlessly into the community, a place Geoffrey once took for granted. "Tyler and Sean are nearly inseparable," James noted. "I've had them over for backyard cookouts, and they spend hours concocting silly games. Great kids." Frances's expression was warm when she looked at James, though a flicker of discomfort passed across her face when she realized Geoffrey was observing them. "James has been a good friend," she said softly, perhaps to clear the air. Geoffrey nodded, forcing a polite smile. He recalled an uneasy feeling, an unspoken fear that maybe Frances had moved on with someone else. He had no right to feel jealous, not after all he'd missed. But the knot in his stomach was undeniable. Soon, Sean and Tyler bounded over, breathless from running. "We're thirsty," they announced in unison. James chuckled and rummaged in a bag for bottles of water. As he handed one to Sean, Geoffrey couldn't help noticing how natural the gesture looked, stirring another wave of guilt and envy. After the children had sated their thirst, Tyler's mother called him from across the playground, and he waved goodbye. James gave a friendly nod to Frances before following his son. Once he was out of earshot, Frances offered Geoffrey an apologetic glance. "Sean and Tyler have been best friends since preschool. James is around a lot." Geoffrey kept his tone neutral. "He seems like a good guy. I'm glad you had friends to rely on." Frances merely nodded, but her expression revealed how complicated that support network might be, especially now that Geoffrey was back. She reached for Sean's hand. "Let's go grab lunch. It's almost noon, and you two have been running around all morning." Sean launched into a detailed explanation of a possible new invention, an ant farm that could swing from side to side while they strolled toward the parking lot. As Geoffrey listened, he felt a wave of paternal pride mingled with the ache of lost time. Here was a bright, caring child who might have been shaping his life for years, if only Geoffrey hadn't shut out Westport. They wrapped up their visit with a simple lunch at a nearby sandwich shop. Sean continued to chatter, unaware of the undercurrents between his mother and the man he still believed was just a friend. In the quiet moments, Geoffrey exchanged knowing glances with Frances, wordless acknowledgments of the complex path they were treading. When they finally parted ways, Sean gave Geoffrey a hug, surprising them both. It was quick and a bit shy, but it felt monumental. Geoffrey swallowed the lump in his throat as he watched mother and son walk away. One small gesture, but it spoke volumes about Sean's budding trust. Driving back to the lake house, Geoffrey replayed every moment, Sean's eager explanations, the boyish grin when he spotted his friend, even the spontaneous hug. For the first time since setting foot in Westport, he experienced a flicker of hope that maybe he could fit into his son's life. Yet in the back of his mind, he couldn't ignore the sense that the distance between his old life in Manhattan and his new reality here was about to widen even further. Settling into the lake house felt surreal. Geoffrey had always imagined the day he'd own this property under happier circumstances, perhaps buying it outright from his uncle as a triumphant return. Instead, every corner reminded him of the years he'd stayed away. Faded photographs, dusty furniture, and Uncle Edward's personal items were all silent witnesses to what might have been. Determined to bring some life back into the space, he spent his days opening windows, letting in the fresh lake breeze, and clearing out boxes of old papers. Every so often, he uncovered something that brought a lump to his throat, a postcard from Francis's college graduation, a pamphlet announcing the birth of baby Sean the town had circulated in some local fundraiser, carefully saved by Edward. This place was more than a home. It was a time capsule of every event Geoffrey had missed. When he ventured into town for supplies, the reception was lukewarm at best. Some folks offered curt nods, while others hurried out of his path. Westport was a small community, and people remembered Geoffrey's abrupt departure. The rare smiles he received always seemed guarded, like they weren't sure if he'd vanish again. One afternoon, as he browsed through shelves at the local bookstore, a voice called out behind him, "Geoffrey Hill, didn't think I'd see you in here." Turning, he found himself face to face with Benjamin Hayes, his former high school teacher. Mr. Hayes was now in his 60s, grey hair thinning, but the same kind eyes and gentle demeanor had endured. A flicker of warmth passed through Geoffrey. "Mr. Hayes, hello. It's been a long time." The older man grinned. "It has. Heard you made quite a name for yourself in the city. I hope you're well." Geoffrey forced a smile. "I'm adapting to being back. It's complicated." Benjamin nodded, leaning on the counter. "This town has a way of humbling us, doesn't it?" He paused, looking Geoffrey up and down. "I remember you being the most ambitious student in my classes. Always wanted bigger things than this quiet place could offer." Geoffrey sighed. "And look where that got me. I lost sight of what was really important." Mr. Hayes's voice softened. "You made mistakes, yes, but it doesn't have to define you forever. Life's full of second chances if you're willing to work for them." They chatted a bit more about the local school system, with Benjamin hinting that Sean was the kind of child who would thrive academically, just like his father. The conversation bolstered Geoffrey's resolve, reminding him he wasn't completely unwelcome in Westport. However, outside the bookstore, that acceptance felt tenuous. He spotted a few neighbors whispering about him, their glances darting away when he turned. The whispers seemed louder at the grocery store and at the cafe, where he caught folks shooting him disapproving looks. Guilt weighed on him. He had earned their distrust, after all. Later that week, Francis allowed him to pick Sean up from school with her explicit instructions. "He doesn't know you're his father yet. Don't say anything if he asks questions." Geoffrey felt the gravity of her words as he parked near the modest brick building. A handful of parents milled around, greeting their kids with hugs and lively chatter. When Sean ran out, backpack bouncing on his small shoulders, he looked momentarily confused before recognizing Geoffrey. "Mr. Hill," he exclaimed, brightening, "Mom said you'd be here." He hopped into the passenger seat of Geoffrey's sedan, excitedly buckling in. A few parents looked on, curiosity plain in their eyes. Geoffrey tried to hide his own nerves, steering the car toward Francis's house. "How was school?" he asked, forcing a casual tone. Sean launched into a breathless account of a science project on insects. "We're studying habitats, and Miss Winters said we can build our own terrariums if we want." He leaned forward in excitement. "Maybe you can help me with that?" Jeffrey's heart squeezed. "I'd love to," he said, thinking how normal and yet extraordinary this conversation felt. "I know a thing or two about designing stuff. We can figure out a plan." As they drove through town, an uneasy feeling nagged at Jeffrey. This was such an ordinary scene, picking a child up from school, discussing homework, yet the entire town seemed to be watching. Even at a stoplight, he caught an elderly couple in the next car, glancing over, no doubt recognizing his face from years ago. He tried not to let it bother him, reminding himself that building trust would take time. They arrived at Francis's home, and Sean bounded out, calling behind him, "Thanks, Mr. Hill," before disappearing through the front door. Francis was waiting in the doorway, hands clasped. She offered a small nod of acknowledgement to Jeffrey, as if to say she appreciated the gesture. Then, with Sean by her side, she closed the door gently. The sense of isolation hit Jeffrey on the drive back to the lake house. He was neither fully accepted nor fully rejected in this town that once was his home. He felt like a guest living in an inheritance he wasn't sure he deserved. Uncle Edward had believed in him enough to leave him the house, but the townspeople's cautious stares, combined with Francis's guarded trust, reminded him that redemption wouldn't come easily. Sitting in the quiet living room that evening, he glanced at a photo of himself as a teenager, standing proudly beside Edward with a fishing pole. In that snapshot, he looked so certain of his future. Now, decades later, he realized certainty was a luxury he no longer possessed. Still, as he gazed at the boyish grin in the photo, he clung to one conviction: whatever it took, he would prove to Westport, and to his son, that he was here to stay. 2 weeks after Jeffrey's first awkward introduction, Francis agreed to let him take Sean fishing at the lake house. The idea came from Sean himself, who, after hearing from older kids in the neighborhood about the lake's legendary trout, begged for a chance to try. Francis hesitated at first, but finally relented, insisting they keep the outing short and safe. On a bright Saturday morning, Sean bounded onto the lakeside dock with an excitement that made Jeffrey's heart soar. Dressed in a small life jacket over his t-shirt, the boy gazed at the tranquil water as if it were a magic realm. "So this is your house?" he asked, eyes wide. "It's huge." Jeffrey laughed softly. "It was my uncle's, actually. Now I'm just taking care of it. The dock's a bit old, so watch your step." They settled near the edge, Sean kneeling beside a battered tackle box. Jeffrey tried to recall the fishing lessons Uncle Edward had given him as a child, the times they'd spent patiently waiting for a bite, talking about everything and nothing. It struck him how once he had chafed at the slow pace, eager to be out conquering the world. Now he longed to recapture that simple contentment with his own son. As they prepped the fishing rods, Sean peppered Jeffrey with questions. "Did you grow up fishing here? Were you good at it?" Jeffrey chuckled. "I caught a few now and then. Uncle Edward was the real expert. He'd say a good fisherman is patient. You have to let the fish come to you." Sean's brow crinkled in concentration. "I can be patient." They cast their lines, the gentle sound of the water lapping against the dock filling the silence. Minutes passed, and Sean fidgeted, eyes darting to the still water. Jeffrey considered it a minor miracle that the boy managed to wait more than 5 minutes before asking, "Do you think there are any fish in this lake, Mr. Hill?" Jeffrey suppressed a grin. "Definitely. We just have to be quiet and let them come to us." They lapsed back into silence, although Sean couldn't resist shooting Jeffrey a hopeful glance every so often. Finally, The boy's bobber dipped sharply. With an excited gasp, he yanked on the rod, nearly losing his grip. Geoffrey moved swiftly, guiding Sean's hands and urging him to keep the line taut. They worked together, reeling in their catch, an impressive perch that flopped on the dock with a burst of silver scales. Wide-eyed, Sean let out a triumphant whoop. "I did it!" He turned to Geoffrey, his face alight with pure joy. "We caught one!" Geoffrey grinned back, heart clenching at the realization that he'd never forget this moment. "Good job, buddy. Uncle Edward would be proud." Something about the phrase caught Sean's attention. He looked up, curiosity plainly etched on his features. "Was your uncle like my dad? Did he teach you things too?" The simple question hung in the air. Geoffrey froze. He'd prepared himself for many topics, but discussing fatherhood directly always felt like stepping on fragile ground. Well, Edward was a father figure to me," he said carefully, hoping that was enough. Sean nodded, seemingly satisfied, then resumed examining the fish. The boy's innocence both warmed and pained Geoffrey. The secret of their relationship felt increasingly heavy. Yet he respected Francis's stance. They had to ease into the truth. As they packed up the tackle box, Dr. Laura Chen, the local pediatrician, strolled by the shoreline, wearing casual weekend clothes. She noticed them and waved. "Well, hello there," she called, stepping closer. "Looks like you had some luck." Geoffrey stood, giving a polite nod. He remembered Dr. Chen from his childhood, though she was only a few years older than him. She extended a warm greeting to Sean, clearly recognizing him as Francis's son. There was a flicker of understanding in her eyes when she saw Geoffrey. "Sean, I see you're quite the fisherman now." Sean beamed. "We're gonna let the fish go. Mr. Hill said it's better to catch and release if we're not going to eat it." "That's right," Dr. Chen said approvingly. "Sustainable fishing. Good lesson." She glanced at Geoffrey. "It's good to see you teaching him these things." Geoffrey shrugged, feeling awkward under her knowing gaze. "We're just having some fun," he said quietly. Dr. Chen nodded. "Fun is important, but so is stability. I'm sure you know that." Her words carried a subtle but unmistakable message. Don't break this boy's heart. With a gentle smile, she continued on her way. Later, after they released the fish and cleaned up, Sean tugged on Geoffrey's sleeve. "Will you teach me more next time?" he asked, eyes shining. "I can come back, right?" Geoffrey's throat constricted. "Any time you want." It was a promise he intended to keep. On the drive back to Francis's, Sean chatted about the fish and how he planned to draw it in his notebook. Geoffrey listened, relishing every detail. When they finally pulled up to Francis's house, the boy turned in his seat. "Thanks, Mr. Hill. That was the coolest morning ever." At the sight of Sean's bright smile, Geoffrey had to blink back an unexpected wave of emotion. "You're welcome," he managed. "We'll do it again soon." He watched Sean scamper up the porch steps. Francis opened the door, offering Geoffrey a faint smile. Even from a distance, he sensed her relief that everything had gone well. It felt like they were building a fragile bridge, each shared moment, each small success, forging a bond that neither had believed possible just weeks ago. The afternoon sunlight streamed into the Westport diner, illuminating each booth in a cozy glow. Geoffrey sat across from Marcus Walsh, his longtime business partner, who had taken it upon himself to fly out to Westport unannounced. At first, Geoffrey was startled to see Marcus's familiar figure outside the lake house that morning. But he agreed to meet at the diner, craving some neutral ground to discuss the tangled mess that was Hilltech. "So," Marcus said, leaning forward, "the rumor mill is going wild. Investors think you've lost your mind, holed up in some small town while the company faces a potential takeover. The board is panicking." Geoffrey exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I know. But it's not that simple. My personal life. Marcus waved a hand dismissively. Your personal life has always been complicated, but we've got employees, shareholders. I've been trying to hold them off, but it's not working. Your extended absence is making them nervous. Jeffrey sensed frustration radiating off Marcus in waves. He couldn't entirely blame him. He had essentially abandoned the reins of Hilltech at a critical juncture. I'm handling as much as I can remotely. Victoria is sending me daily reports, he countered. Just give me a little more time. Marcus scoffed, keeping his voice low. We don't have a little more time. The board wants you back in Manhattan next week for an emergency meeting. Before Jeffrey could respond, he saw Francis and Sean step into the diner, scanning for an empty booth. They spotted him almost instantly, and Francis hesitated, as if unsure whether to approach. Sean, however, barreled forward, waving. "Mr. Hill," the boy called cheerfully. Marcus's eyes flicked from Sean to Francis, then back to Jeffrey with puzzlement. "Who are they?" Jeffrey cleared his throat. "Friends," he said curtly. "Give me a minute." He stood, heart pounding, and crossed the diner. Francis shifted her weight uncertainly, trying to gauge the situation. "Didn't mean to interrupt," she said softly, casting a glance toward Marcus. Jeffrey forced a smile. "You're not interrupting. Sean, this is Marcus, my business partner." Sean looked past Jeffrey and waved shyly at the man in the booth. Marcus offered a polite but stiff smile, evidently trying to piece together the dynamic. Jeffrey noticed how Francis kept a protective arm around Sean, as though uncertain of the vibe between the two men. "We were just grabbing lunch," Francis said, gesturing to the back corner. "We can head somewhere else if you're in the middle of something." "It's fine," Jeffrey reassured her. "We're almost done anyway." At that moment, Marcus stood and walked over, extending a hand toward Francis. "Marcus Walsh," he introduced himself. "I didn't realize Jeffrey had friends in Westport." Francis's face hardened slightly at the implication that Jeffrey's connections here might be limited. "Francis Reynolds," she replied politely. "Sean and I have lived here our whole lives." Sean tugged on Francis's sleeve. "Mom, can we get a milkshake?" he asked. Oblivious to the tension, Francis nodded, leading him to an empty booth. As she settled him in, Marcus turned to Jeffrey with a baffled frown. "That kid, he looks an awful lot like you." Jeffrey's stomach tightened. He had hoped to avoid explaining the situation to Marcus in a public place, but here they were. He leaned in. "Sean is my son," he said quietly. "I only found out recently." Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "Your son? Since when?" "Long story," Jeffrey muttered. "The short version is that I didn't know about him until I came back to settle my uncle's estate. Now I'm trying to make things right." Marcus glanced at the boy sitting with Francis, mouth agape for a moment. "Does the board know this changes everything?" Jeffrey felt a flash of anger at how Marcus framed it as a business complication, but he also understood that was the world they had built together. Hilltech's success came from their single-minded focus, a drive that overshadowed family ties. "No, they don't, and I don't want to make it a public spectacle," Jeffrey said firmly. "I need to handle this on my own terms." Their conversation hung in the air until the waitress delivered the check. Marcus paid it with an impatient sigh, clearly unsettled by the news. "All right, look," he said, stepping closer to Jeffrey to keep his voice down. "I'll tell the board you're dealing with a personal matter, but it can't go on indefinitely. Next week is the absolute deadline. Show up, or they'll start the process to remove you as CEO." Jeffrey nodded, dread pooling in his stomach. He watched as Marcus left, shoulders tense. Then he turned his gaze to Francis and Sean, who were sipping a shared milkshake. Their laughter was a stark contrast to the suffocating pressure of Manhattan's corporate world. He approached their booth, slipping in beside Sean. The boy beamed, oblivious to the storm clouds gathering in Geoffrey's mind. Francis offered a concerned look. "Are you all right?" It looked tense. Geoffrey forced a small smile. "Just some business issues." He reached for a spare straw, stirring the shake absent-mindedly. "The truth is, Hiltek's in trouble if I don't go back soon. Marcus wants me there next week." Sean glanced between them. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice small. The question felt like a punch to Geoffrey's gut. This was exactly what Francis feared, that he'd disappear again. "I have to handle a few things," Geoffrey said gently, "but I promise I'm not walking away. I just need to sort some things out." Francis's expression was guarded, as though bracing for him to break his promise. Sean's eyes reflected confusion and worry. In that moment, Geoffrey felt the weight of both worlds pressing down on him, the corporation he built from nothing and the child he had unknowingly left behind. He swallowed, placing a hand over Sean's. "I'll be back," he vowed, locking eyes with Francis. Her silence spoke volumes, as though she was silently daring him to prove his words weren't empty. Yet even as he assured them, he wondered how he would navigate the collision of these two worlds, each demanding a different part of him. Could he truly honor both commitments, or would he find himself forced to sacrifice one for the other? He wished for the simplicity of the morning's fishing trips, a simplicity that now felt like it was slipping through his fingers. Geoffrey paced the length of the lake house living room, cell phone pressed to his ear as Victoria's voice crackled through the line. She was reciting a list of urgent tasks piling up at Hiltek. Her words rushed and clipped. He should have been fully focused on her rundown of pending projects, but instead he found himself looking at Sean's drawings taped to the refrigerator, the boy's shaky handwriting labeling each crayon invention as "my new idea." "Geoffrey, did you hear me?" Victoria's tone sharpened. "We have less than a week until the board meeting. Marcus is doing his best, but the investors are restless. You need to come back to Manhattan, at least for a few days." He let out a breath. "I know," he said softly, "but I can't leave Westport just yet. I promised Sean and Francis I'd be here. Besides, Sean's science fair is next week, and he wants me to help him finish his ant habitat project." As soon as the words came out, he realized how they might sound to someone deeply entrenched in corporate life, skipping a critical meeting for a child's elementary school event. There was a heavy pause before Victoria spoke again, carefully. "Hiltek is on the brink, Geoffrey, but I understand. I know this is important." Her tone signaled that she had more to say, but instead she cleared her throat and continued, "I'll do what I can here, but you'll have to show face soon. We can't stall forever." After the call ended, he stared at the silent phone for a moment. The duality of his life was hitting him like never before. In Manhattan, he was Geoffrey Hill, CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, expected to lead ruthless negotiations. In Westport, he was a newcomer father, trying to make up for lost time, searching for acceptance from a wary community and forging a fragile bond with his son. Both roles demanded his full devotion, and both would resent being second place. His reflections were interrupted by a knock at the door. Opening it, he found Francis on the porch, her arms folded and her brow furrowed. "Sean's at my mom's," she said quietly. "I wanted to talk to you alone." Stepping aside, he invited her in. The house was still in mild disarray from his impromptu redecorating attempts, half-unpacked boxes and dust sheets stacked in corners. Francis surveyed the mess with a slight frown. "You've been busy," she noted. He managed a small laugh. "I'm trying to make it more livable." "Uncle Edward left a lot of memories." She nodded, then drew a breath, her tone serious. "Look, Mum's been hinting that I should keep everything with Sean more structured. She thinks you might disappear if work calls. I keep telling her you're trying to stay, but—" Geoffrey held up a hand. "Margaret has every right to worry. I can't deny that my life in Manhattan is complicated." Frances studied him, her expression conflicted. "Complicated might be an understatement. I saw how tense you looked at the diner with your partner, Marcus. Are you in serious trouble?" He leaned against the side table, feeling the weight of her question. "I might lose my position at Hilltech if I don't go back and handle the board. I built that company from the ground up with Marcus, but at the same time, I won't just abandon Sean again." Her gaze flicked to the child's drawings on the fridge. "So you're torn?" It wasn't a question, just a statement of fact. He nodded. "Yes, torn is the right word." A silence stretched between them, filled by the hum of the lake breeze through an open window. For a moment, they simply stood there, acknowledging the enormity of the choices ahead. "Whatever you decide," Frances said finally, "Sean's needs have to come first. I won't let him get hurt again." Jeffrey's jaw tightened. "I won't walk away." "Not this time." Frances gave a small, weary smile. "I hope you mean that." Then she sighed. "Anyway, you wanted to help Sean with his science fair project. He's excited to show you how the ants tunnel. We're going to pick up supplies tomorrow. I thought you might come along." He agreed without hesitation, despite the mental tally of business obligations piling up. Frances turned to leave, pausing at the threshold. "By the way, James asked if we wanted to join a weekend family event at the community center. He's a friend, but if you feel—" "It's okay," Jeffrey cut in, forcing a casual tone. "You two have known each other a while. Sean likes him." She studied him for a second, something unspoken passing between them. Then she nodded and stepped out, leaving him alone in the hushed living room. The screen door clicked shut behind her. He exhaled, sinking into a nearby chair. He felt as though every choice he made left him precariously balancing two worlds, Hilltech's demands and his new responsibilities as a father. Each day, the pull of Manhattan grew more relentless, while the promise he had made in Westport took on deeper meaning. As he picked up Sean's drawings, he traced a finger over the childish scrawl. In that moment, he thought about the father he never truly had, and he vowed not to repeat the same mistakes. But the question remained, how could he hold on to both the child he'd just found and the company that defined him for so long? The weight of that decision bore down on him, and he wondered which side would crack under the strain first. 2 days later, Jeffrey walked through the wrought-iron gates of Westport's small cemetery, autumn leaves crunching beneath his shoes. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the headstones. He had avoided this place for years, unable to face the memories buried along with his parents, but after all he'd learned these past weeks, especially about the father he swore he'd never become, he felt compelled to come. He made his way to a modest headstone where his father's name was chiseled into the granite, Thomas Hill, 1950-2005. Beside it was the marker for his mother, who had passed not long after from what people called a broken heart. Jeffrey stood there, wrestling with old anger and sorrow. His father had been distant, a workaholic who never had time for a boy desperate for attention. In many ways, the trajectory that led Jeffrey to Manhattan, building Hilltech, felt like a rebellion against that paternal neglect. He vowed he'd surpass every expectation, no matter the cost. He crouched, tracing the engraved letters with his fingertips. "I used to blame you," he said in a hushed voice, "for chasing your ambition at the expense of your family, but I'm realizing I've done the same thing." The breeze ruffled his hair, but the silence offered no absolution. He stayed there a long while, lost in thought, until the snap of a twig made him turn. Frances stood a few steps behind, wearing a light jacket and an uncertain expression. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I saw your car parked outside." "I didn't mean to intrude," Jeffrey straightened. "It's all right. I just I wanted to see them. I never came back for their funerals, sent flowers, but—" He trailed off, recalling that guilt he'd buried under layers of ambition. Francis took a tentative step forward. "I know it's not easy. I used to come here with Sean when he was little, to leave flowers on your Uncle Edward's grave. Your parents' headstones aren't far from his." She paused, studying him. "You didn't just leave me back then. You left everything." He nodded, gaze dropping to the ground. "After the bankruptcy, I felt ashamed, like I'd let everyone down, including them. Running away seemed like the only option." A wry smile curved his lips. "Turns out, leaving isn't the same as forgetting." Francis approached the adjacent marker, Uncle Edward's grave. She placed a small pebble on its surface, a simple gesture of remembrance. "Edward was always kind to me," she said quietly. "He never openly criticized you for leaving, but I think he hoped you'd come back and make things right." Geoffrey swallowed, recalling the thick file of Sean's photos and the letters that Edward had meticulously saved. "He was trying to keep me connected, even when I refused to listen." Francis rubbed her arms as a chill wind swept through the cemetery. "I felt his absence so acutely after Sean was born. He was the only one who tried to help me reach you. When that failed, he just supported me in his own quiet way." At the mention of Sean, Geoffrey's chest tightened. He glanced again at his father's grave, struck by the fear that he might leave Sean the same bitter legacy, a father who let work overshadow everything else. "I'm trying to do better," he said, voice strained, "but there's so much I can't fix." Francis's gaze softened. "You can't change the past, but you can shape what happens next. I see how you look at Sean, how you've been showing up for him. That's something." They stood in silence for a moment, the subdued hush of the cemetery echoing in the background. Finally, Francis spoke, her tone hesitant. "There's something else. James asked me to a fundraiser dinner for the local hospital next month. He thinks it might be good for me to get out, socialize." She paused. "I wanted you to hear it from me, not from gossip." A flicker of jealousy sparked in Geoffrey's chest, though he tried to hide it. He knew James was a friend to Francis, maybe more than a friend in the time Geoffrey had been gone. "You don't owe me an explanation," he said carefully. "We're not—" She cut him off gently. "I'm telling you because I don't want you blindsided by rumors. This town loves to whisper, especially when it comes to me and you. And James has been a good support system for Sean too, but I haven't promised him anything." A swirl of complex emotions welled up, regret for past mistakes, envy at the thought of another man stepping into a fatherly role, and gratitude that Francis was at least honest with him. "I appreciate you telling me. I want what's best for you and Sean, really." She studied him, seeming to weigh the sincerity in his voice. Then she nodded. "All right." Glancing toward the gravestones one more time, she let out a quiet breath. "I'll let you finish here." Once she was gone, Geoffrey felt an odd emptiness settle over him. He resumed staring at his parents' names, etched in stone. All those years he spent resenting his father for chasing success, only to replicate the same choices. His stomach churned with the realization that if he wasn't careful, he'd leave Sean with the same aching questions that haunted him. Eventually, the sun slipped lower in the sky, casting the cemetery in golden light. Geoffrey whispered a final goodbye, uncertain if his father could hear his words in the quiet hush of this place. "I can't change what happened," he repeated, his voice shaking slightly, "but I'll do better, I promise." Stepping away, he left the cemetery feeling both lighter and more burdened, uncertain how to resolve the ghosts of his past with the demands of his present. One thing was clear: running away was no longer an option. The day of Sean's science fair dawned crisp and sunny. At Westport Elementary, the gymnasium bustled with excited children and proud parents. Rows of folding tables displayed dioramas, homemade volcanoes and poster boards detailing every topic from recycled water projects to solar system explorations. In the corner near the windows, Sean carefully arranged his ant habitat, a glass box filled with tunnels he'd meticulously built with Jeffrey's help. Jeffrey hovered beside him, offering tips on how to position the little ant farm so the sunlight wouldn't overheat the insects. Francis stood off to the side, allowing father and son this moment but keeping a close watch. The arrangement felt almost normal, almost like a real family. All morning, curious teachers and other parents stopped by Sean's table. Miss Winters, his teacher, beamed at the display. "Wonderful job, Sean. I love the detail on these tunnels." Sean grinned, looking to Jeffrey as if expecting praise. "Mr. Hill helped me figure out how to keep the structure stable," he proudly announced, pointing to the thin rods that supported the delicate tunnels. Ms. Winters nodded approvingly. "Engineering skills come in handy, huh?" Jeffrey smiled, but his heart twisted a bit. He longed to hear Sean call him Dad. Yet he knew they weren't there. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. As Mrs. Winters moved on, Frances approached with 2 cups of lemonade. She handed one to Jeffrey, their eyes meeting in a silent exchange of thanks. Sean's display was drawing a steady crowd, and he launched into an animated explanation of how ants communicate using pheromones. Jeffrey observed how easily the boy held people's attention, brimming with a confidence that might be a precursor to the future scientist or inventor he dreamed of becoming. A shrill ring from Jeffrey's phone broke the momentary peace. He pulled it out, seeing Marcus's name flashing on the screen. He contemplated ignoring it, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at him. "I'll be right back," he murmured to Francis, stepping outside the gym into the hallway. Marcus's voice crackled with impatience. "Jeffrey, where are you? The board meeting started 20 minutes ago." A knot formed in Jeffrey's stomach. He had lost track of time, so immersed in Sean's big day. "Marcus, I told you I can't make it in person," he said, trying to keep his voice low. "I'm with my—" He paused, almost saying son, but he caught himself. "I'm dealing with a personal matter." "Personal matter. We're on the brink of a hostile takeover. The board demanded you appear via video at the very least. You know how critical this is." Marcus's tone grew sharper. "I've fought tooth and nail for us, for our vision, and you're blowing off the biggest crisis we've ever faced." Outside the hallway window, Jeffrey caught a glimpse of Sean enthusiastically pointing at his project. The boy turned, scanning the crowd, likely wondering where Jeffrey had gone. Jeffrey sighed, torn. "Marcus, I'm sorry. I got delayed." His partner let out a frustrated breath. "The entire board is furious. They're threatening to force a vote to remove you as CEO. Some of the top investors want quick, decisive leadership, and your absence sends the wrong message." Jeffrey's chest tightened. "I'll call in right now. Just give me 5 minutes." He hung up before Marcus could object and hurried toward a small, empty office near the school lobby. Flicking on the light, he opened his laptop, hoping the school's Wi-Fi would cooperate. Just as he logged onto the video conference, the door creaked open. Frances peeked in. "Is everything all right?" she asked softly. "I have to handle an urgent meeting," he said, voice heavy with tension. "Could you keep an eye on Sean for a bit?" She nodded. "Of course, but hurry back if you can. He's about to give a presentation to the judges." Jeffrey swallowed a rising panic. The meeting's video feed connected, revealing a virtual room of stern-faced board members. Marcus's square was in the corner, jaw tight. Over the next half hour, Jeffrey fielded a barrage of pointed questions about Hilltech's future. At one point, an investor asked, "Why should we believe you're still committed to this company, Mr. Hill? Your absence at such a critical juncture speaks volumes." Anger and embarrassment roiled in him. He tried to remain calm. "I am committed. I had an urgent personal issue, but I'm fully prepared to guide Hilltech. A text notification popped up on his screen from Francis. Judges are here for Sean's presentation. He's looking for you. Guilt struck him like a slap. He glanced at the clock on the bottom corner of his laptop. Time was slipping away. The board pressed on with more demands, insisting on immediate strategies. Jeffrey felt his stomach churn. He was stuck in this conference, risking the company he built from nothing. Yet each passing minute meant missing Sean's big moment, another blow to a child who already questioned if his father cared. Sweat beaded on his brow as he tried to close out the call diplomatically. He ended with a hurried promise to email follow-up plans, ignoring the board's glares. Quickly shutting the laptop, he sprinted back to the gym. He arrived just as Sean was wrapping up his talk. The judges were smiling, nodding in appreciation. Frances stood by, relief washing over her face when she saw Jeffrey, but Sean's expression flickered with disappointment. The boy had noticed his absence. Jeffrey rushed over, placing a hand on Sean's shoulder. "I'm sorry I missed your presentation," he whispered. Sean shrugged, his small face betraying the hurt. "That's okay," he mumbled, turning away. The subdued tone stabbed Jeffrey's conscience. The rest of the event passed in a blur, with children laughing and teachers congratulating each other. Sean managed a tight smile when he won second place in his category, but he didn't run up to Jeffrey for a celebratory hug the way he did to Francis. That singular moment crystallized the cost of Jeffrey's divided focus. For the first time, he felt the edges of his world fracturing, threatening to pull him apart completely. 2 days after the science fair, Jeffrey found himself in the polished marble lobby of Hilltech's headquarters in Manhattan. The drive up from Westport felt like a journey between two alien planets, and his heart twisted with every block closer to the monolithic skyscrapers. He'd left Westport at dawn, whispering an apologetic goodbye to Sean, who was still half asleep on the couch at Francis's place. The boy had barely acknowledged him. Now, inside the sleek, modern building, he was greeted by an air of formality that once felt like home. Men and women in tailored suits bustled about with purposeful strides. Receptionists offered polite nods of recognition. Yet Jeffrey couldn't escape a gnawing sense of dislocation. He stepped into the executive elevator alone, ignoring the swirling anxiety in his chest. By the time he reached the top floor, he had braced himself for confrontation. The board meeting was already in full swing. Marcus waited outside the glass conference room, arms crossed. "Where have you been?" Marcus hissed, though relief flickered in his eyes. "They're threatening to vote today on your removal if you don't present a plan." Jeffrey straightened his tie, trying to reclaim the confidence that used to come so easily. "I'll handle it." Stepping inside, he was met by a row of board members, their expressions varying from curiosity to outright hostility. The conference room's walls of glass overlooked the Manhattan skyline. In another life, that panorama represented everything he'd worked for: power, ambition, success. Now it just reminded him of all he stood to lose outside this boardroom, namely his son's fragile trust. The chairman, a stern-faced man with silver hair named Howard Albright, cleared his throat. "Mr. Hill, we've given you ample time to stabilize your personal life. Meanwhile, this company has been left floundering in crisis. We want to hear how you intend to steer Hilltech forward." Jeffrey inhaled deeply. "I'm aware the company is at risk," he began. "I've drafted a restructuring plan that addresses our immediate vulnerabilities. Key among these is refocusing on our core cybersecurity products, streamlining extraneous departments, and forging strategic partnerships with smaller tech firms rather than chasing risky mergers. He clicked through slides on a monitor, explaining how the plan would cut overhead and bolster Hilltech's core strengths. The board members asked pointed questions, and Marcus chimed in with a few supportive remarks, though his frustration at Jeffrey's recent absence was evident. Over the next hour, Geoffrey argued passionately, determined to prove he hadn't lost his edge. When he finished, there was a pause. Howard folded his hands on the table. "It's a compelling plan," he admitted. "But can you commit to staying here, actively leading, for the next 6 to 12 months? We need stability at the helm, not an absentee CEO." All eyes fell on Geoffrey. His mind flashed back to Sean's disappointed face at the science fair. He pictured the lake house, Francis's guarded expression, the soft hush of Westport streets. Then he looked around at the sleek conference table, the city lights glinting in the background. This was the life he had built. These people, this company. Could he walk away? Or conversely, could he remain and risk neglecting the son he'd just discovered? He cleared his throat, buying time. "I'm prepared," he said slowly, measuring every word, "to be here as often as necessary, provided I can occasionally commute back to Westport to address important family matters. We can set up a remote system that—" A low murmur ran through the room. The chairman's expression darkened. "That doesn't sound like the unwavering commitment we need, Mr. Hill. You either lead us full-time or you step aside." A surge of anger welled up in Geoffrey. These people saw him only as a figurehead, a machine to drive their profits. But then, wasn't that exactly what he'd become in pursuit of success? He caught Marcus's eye, noting the silent plea there. "Give them what they want. You can't do this job halfway." Geoffrey swallowed. "Fine," he said at last. "I'll base myself in Manhattan for the critical phases of this plan, but I'm not abandoning Westport entirely. If that's a deal-breaker—" Howard leaned forward. "We'll accept your partial presence, provided the company's performance improves significantly in the next quarter. Otherwise, the board reserves the right to reconsider your position." He nodded, feeling both relief and a stab of remorse. The rest of the meeting droned on with final questions and clarifications. By the time it ended, the city skyline was awash in late afternoon light. Marcus walked over, wearing a conflicted expression. "Thanks for pulling it together," he said, handing Geoffrey a stack of documents. "We needed that, but are you sure you can juggle both lives? It's not going to get easier." Geoffrey let out a weary breath. "I don't know, but I have no choice." Marcus nodded. "I get it. My own situation with my wife. Sometimes I feel torn apart. But at least you and I can rely on each other here." He offered a faint smile, then turned to organize some files. Leaving the conference room, Geoffrey retreated to his corner office. The panoramic windows offered a commanding view of Manhattan's bustle. Taxis, towering buildings, neon billboards. Normally, he would revel in the victory of surviving another power struggle. Today, it felt hollow. He sank into his leather chair, rubbed his temples, and wondered how he'd explain all this to Francis and Sean. Or if, in the process of keeping Hilltech afloat, he'd revert to the same absentee father he vowed never to be. He picked up his phone, hoping to call Francis. But instead, he found himself staring at a photo he'd discreetly taken of Sean earlier in the week, the boy beaming next to his ant habitat. "I need to make this work," he told himself, desperation clawing at his chest. There must be a way to succeed at both. But a cold whisper in his mind reminded him that he'd tried this balancing act before and had failed, spectacularly. A week passed, and Geoffrey divided his time between Manhattan and Westport, each visit feeling more strained than the last. The strategy at Hilltech was showing modest signs of success. The board, though still skeptical, had conceded that Geoffrey's restructuring plan might hold promise. Investors were temporarily appeased. Yet each achievement in the city came at a steep price in Westport, where Sean seemed increasingly wary of his sporadic appearances. Late one evening, Geoffrey arrived back in Westport after a grueling day of meetings. The house was dark, except for a single lamp glowing in the living room. He flipped on a light switch, exhaustion pressing down on him. Moments later, he heard a soft knock at the front door. Opening it, he found Frances, wearing a thick sweater against the chill. She stepped inside, arms wrapped around herself. "I saw your car," she said quietly. "Wanted to check on you. You look exhausted." He sank onto the couch. "I feel like I'm being torn in half," he admitted, resting his head in his hands. "Work's demanding more of me than ever, and I can't keep vanishing on them. But Sean, he's pulling away. I can see it every time I skip a day or come home late." Frances nodded gravely, sitting beside him. "He asks me questions. Why does Mr. Hill have to work so much? Why can't he stay for dinner like other dads?" Her voice trembled slightly. "He's confused. I told him you care, but you have responsibilities in the city." "I do care," Jeffrey said, voice rough. "But I have to keep my company afloat, or I lose everything I've worked for. And I can't risk my stake in it. Hilltech is part of who I am." A shaky exhale escaped Frances. "I'm not asking you to abandon your life. I'm asking you to balance it so Sean isn't left wondering if you'll show up. If that's impossible, then be honest with him. Don't let him hope for something that won't happen." They sat in a tense silence, the only sound the faint hum of the heater clicking on. Jeffrey reflected on all the missed moments: Sean's second-place victory at the science fair, dinners with Frances and Margaret that he'd bailed on. The childlike trust in Sean's eyes was dimming, replaced by a reserved politeness that pained Jeffrey more than any hostile board meeting ever could. He swallowed. "I never understood how much damage my father did by being absent. Now I'm doing the same. The worst part is, I see it happening and I can't seem to stop it." Frances placed a hand on his arm. "You still have a choice. Make it differently than your father did." Just then, his phone buzzed again. He instinctively reached for it, eyes flicking over a message from Marcus. "We need immediate numbers for tomorrow's investor call." Urgent. Jeffrey felt his pulse spike, the old panic resurfacing. He typed a hasty response, promising to send the figures soon. Frances watched him, her gaze heavy with both empathy and sorrow. "This isn't sustainable, Jeffrey. You're at your breaking point." He let the phone slip from his hand. "I know," he whispered, "but what's the alternative? If I step down from Hilltech, I'll lose everything I built." Frances rose, turning to face him. "You won't lose everything," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "You'll still have a chance to be a father to Sean. You'll have a chance to build something here that's not measured in profit margins." Jeffrey stared at her, mind whirling with conflicting impulses. The idea of walking away from Hilltech seemed unthinkable, like severing a limb. Yet the pain of losing Sean or disappointing him further felt even worse. I don't know if I can," he murmured. She leaned down, pressing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Think about it, and talk to Sean. He deserves honesty." "We both do." With that, she left, and the soft click of the door echoing through the empty house. Jeffrey sat there for a long while, wrestling with the choices that loomed before him. His entire life had been defined by Hilltech, yet for the first time, he saw a future that wasn't anchored to Manhattan skyscrapers. A future anchored instead to a small boy's open smile and the quiet waters of a Connecticut lake. Slumping back on the couch, he closed his eyes, letting the weight of the day wash over him. In the dark silence, he recalled the unwavering love that Uncle Edward had shown, the determined resilience Frances displayed, and the hopeful questions in Sean's bright green eyes. He realized it wasn't just about picking fatherhood over business or vice versa. It was about choosing to be the man he wished his own father had been. As night wrapped the lake house in stillness, Jeffrey stared at his phone, ignoring the endless pings from Manhattan. He knew a reckoning was near. One way or another, A sacrifice had to be made. And as he gazed at a framed photo of Sean fishing off the old dock, a photo Uncle Edward had left behind, he felt a shift within him, a glimmer of resolve that scared him as much as it offered hope. From the very moment Jeffrey opened his eyes that morning, he sensed something was off. A raw tension crackled in the air, one he couldn't quite name but felt deep in his gut. He glanced around the lake house's still shadowy living room, where papers from Hiltec and sketches of Sean's latest invention were scattered side by side on the coffee table. The sharp contrast reminded him of how fragile the balance in his life had become. Francis's call arrived at dawn, urgent and trembling. By the time he answered, he could barely catch her words through her ragged breathing. "He's gone," she managed, voice cracking. "Sean is missing." Jeffrey's heart pounded so loudly he was certain she could hear it over the phone. "Missing? What? Where?" "He ran off after school yesterday. I thought he was in his room. I checked on him first thing this morning, and Jeffrey, he's not here." He felt the blood drain from his face. "I'm coming," he said, already grabbing his keys. Within minutes, he was behind the wheel, speeding through Westport's winding roads. Images of Sean's distraught face flooding his mind. The boy had been distant lately, showing the first signs of anger and frustration toward Jeffrey's back-and-forth schedule. He was old enough to sense when something wasn't right, and apparently old enough to decide he'd had enough. Frances was waiting outside her home, pale with worry. Margaret stood beside her, eyes red-rimmed, clutching a sweater in her hands. When Jeffrey pulled up, both women rushed toward him. "Any sign?" Jeffrey asked, throwing the car door open. Frances shook her head in despair. "I've called his teacher, his friend's parents. No one's seen him." "James is out driving around the neighborhood. The police said they'd keep an eye out, but it hasn't been long enough for an official search." Her breath hitched. "I'm so scared." Jeffrey felt a jolt of urgency. "He mentioned the lake house before," he said. "Sometimes he goes there to draw or just think. I'll check the property. You two keep calling around. We'll find him." He sped off, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Memories of his own childhood stirred, nights he'd considered running away from his father's suffocating silence, only to hide in the very place he felt truly free. Uncle Edward's dock. Sean might have the same instinct. Pulling up to the lake house, Jeffrey threw the car into park and jumped out. He called Sean's name repeatedly, voice echoing across the still water. The early morning mist clung to the shore, obscuring sight beyond a few yards. Near the creaking dock, he finally spotted a small figure crouched at the edge. "Sean!" Jeffrey shouted, relief and fear colliding in his chest. He sprinted forward, heart pounding as he made out the boy's hunched shoulders. Sean didn't move at the sound of his name. He just stared into the water, hugging his knees to his chest. Panting, Jeffrey skidded to a stop, kneeling beside him. "Sean, thank God." "We've been worried sick." For a moment, the child remained silent, stiff with tension. Then he turned slightly, revealing tear-streaked cheeks. "I didn't mean to make Mom worry," he mumbled. I felt like I needed to get away." Jeffrey swallowed. "I know. I'm sorry you felt that way." He reached out, hesitant, placing a hand on Sean's shoulder. "Let me take you home." Sean shook his head stubbornly. "I don't want to go home. I hate feeling like this. It's like I'm always waiting for you to come back, or waiting for you to leave again." His voice quivered with the pent-up frustration of a child who's held things inside for too long. Guilt tore through Jeffrey. He inched closer, knees digging into the damp wood of the dock. "Sean," he began softly, heart pounding. "There's something you need to know. Something your mom and I haven't told you yet." The boy looked up, confusion flashing in his wide green eyes. "What?" Jeffrey inhaled shakily. He remembered Frances's repeated admonitions about timing, about doing this gently. But they weren't in a place to wait any longer. This was the moment. "I'm not just an old family friend," he said, voice trembling. I'm your father." The silence felt absolute. For a fraction of a second, time itself seemed to freeze. Sean's eyes flickered with a raw vulnerability that slammed into Jeffrey's chest like a sledgehammer. "You're my dad," Sean whispered, tears spilling anew. "I asked Mom about you, but she said my dad was away. You left years ago." Jeffrey's throat constricted. "Yes, I didn't know about you until recently. I messed up terribly, and I—" He paused, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I didn't want to leave you. I just didn't know you existed." "I promise." Sean's small fists curled, voice trembling with hurt. "Then why didn't you come when you found out? Why do you keep leaving for work? Everyone says you have this big, important company, so maybe you don't need me." Tears burned at Jeffrey's eyes, and he didn't bother hiding them. He reached out and gently took Sean's hand. "I do need you. More than anything. I left once because I was stupid and scared, and I'm sorry. That's on me. But I swear, I came back to Westport to be with you." They sat there in the mist, father and son, a swirl of emotion crackling in the air. Sean lowered his gaze to where Jeffrey's hand gripped his. "I didn't know you were my dad," he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. "I feel so confused." Jeffrey hesitated, then gently pulled him into a hug. For a moment, Sean resisted, stiff and uncertain. Then, as though a dam broke, he wrapped his arms around Jeffrey's neck, sobbing into his shoulder. Jeffrey held him close, absorbing every tremor of the boy's grief and anger. "I'm sorry," Jeffrey whispered, voice raw. "I'm here now. I'm not running away again." Through ragged breaths, Sean's voice emerged muffled. "Promise." "Yes," Jeffrey said simply, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "I promise." No more secrets. He stayed kneeling there, letting the morning sun break through the mist and warm their faces. A wave of relief mingled with a fresh surge of responsibility, the knowledge that from now on he couldn't hide behind half measures or indefinite plans. This was his child, and a new path had opened, a moment of truth he could never undo. Whatever came next, he had to see it through. They drove back to Francis's house in silence, Sean dozing in the passenger seat, emotionally spent from the upheaval of the morning. When Jeffrey pulled up to the driveway, Francis and Margaret rushed outside, eyes brimming with relief. Francis opened the car door carefully and cupped Sean's face in her hands. "Are you all right?" she asked, voice shaking. Sean nodded, fatigue plain on his face. Margaret cast a fierce look at Jeffrey. "What happened? Where did you find him?" Jeffrey gently shut the car door. "He went to the lake house dock. I told him the truth, Margaret." His own voice sounded foreign to his ears, still unsteady. "He knows I'm his father." Francis's head whipped around, eyes widening. For a moment, a surge of panic flickered across her features. This was exactly the scenario they'd both wanted to handle more gradually. But seeing Sean's anguished, tired expression, she simply nodded. "Maybe it was time," she whispered. "Come inside." Margaret gathered Sean in her arms, helping him to the couch. He sank into the cushions, hugging a throw pillow as if it were a shield. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he didn't appear to be crying anymore. Francis pulled a blanket over him, brushing a hand through his unruly hair. With Margaret tending to the boy, Jeffrey and Francis quietly stepped into the kitchen. "He found out everything," Jeffrey murmured, leaning against the counter. "I couldn't hide it, not when he asked me point blank. He wants to know why I left, why I wasn't there." Francis exhaled, pressing her hands to her temples. "I was afraid of this moment. I wanted to protect him, but maybe he needed to hear it from you." She glanced over her shoulder toward the living room, where Sean was half listening to Margaret's soothing words. "He's never been this upset before," Guilt churned in Jeffrey's gut. "We'll figure it out together. I'm not leaving Westport until we do." Frances rubbed her eyes. "James suggested we consider a family therapist for Sean, a neutral person to help him through this confusion. Maybe that's a good idea." Jeffrey hesitated, recalling a therapist he once briefly saw in Manhattan, an arrangement he dropped when business overshadowed everything else. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think it could help. I want him to feel safe talking about whatever he's feeling, especially if it's anger at me." Frances turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. "Thank you for saying that. I was worried you'd fight the idea." He shook his head. "No, I'll do what's best for Sean." A soft knock at the front door startled them both. Frances frowned, exchanging a glance with Jeffrey before peering out the window. She sighed, then opened the door to James Peterson, who stood with a concerned expression and a grocery bag in hand. "I heard," he said, his gaze flicking from Frances to Jeffrey. "Is Sean okay?" Frances nodded. "He's resting now. It was a rough morning." James entered cautiously, as though testing the emotional temperature of the room. Setting the grocery bag on the countertop, he pulled out a container of homemade soup. "I thought it might help, something warm." Frances offered a grateful smile. "Thank you, James. That's very thoughtful." Jeffrey felt a pang of awkwardness. He recognized James was just being kind, but he couldn't entirely quell the twist of jealousy that surfaced whenever the man appeared. At the same time, he acknowledged James had been a steady presence in Frances and Sean's life, something Jeffrey himself had failed to be. James turned to Jeffrey. "I'm glad you found him," he said, voice calm yet weighted. "We drove around the neighborhood for an hour." "Thanks for helping," Jeffrey replied. The two men's eyes met briefly in mutual understanding. Both cared for Sean, though their roles were vastly different. Margaret appeared in the kitchen doorway, speaking in hushed tones. "He's asleep. Poor child is exhausted. I'm going to make some tea." They all settled around the table, an unspoken truce forming in the interest of Sean's well-being. Frances explained her plan to schedule therapy sessions with Dr. Melissa Rivera, the local counselor experienced in child psychology. Jeffrey agreed immediately, though part of him dreaded the painful conversations that would inevitably surface. He would have to confront his own guilt and the dark corners of his past, maybe even his unresolved issues with his own father. James quietly excused himself once the plan was set, leaving behind the soup. As he stepped outside, he paused, turning to Frances. "Call me if you need anything. I mean it." After he was gone, an uneasy hush settled in the kitchen. Margaret busied herself making tea, while Frances and Jeffrey exchanged weary looks. "We'll tell Sean about Dr. Rivera when he wakes up," Frances said at last. "I have a feeling he'll be reluctant, but we have to try." Jeffrey nodded. "I'll be here. Whatever he needs." Margaret set cups of chamomile tea on the table, her stern demeanor temporarily softened. "Jeffrey, I won't pretend I don't harbor resentment for how you left. But I see you're trying. That counts for something." She glanced at the living room, her gaze laden with love and concern for her grandson. "Just don't let him down again. He can't take it." The weight of her words pressed on Jeffrey's chest. "I won't," he said, voice quiet. "Never again." Together, they sipped tea in silence, each lost in thoughts of the fraught morning and the promise of uncertain days ahead. For Jeffrey, there was a strange mixture of despair and hope. Sean finally knew the truth, but at what cost? The boy's world had been rocked, and it was now Jeffrey's responsibility to help rebuild a sense of safety. He promised himself he would face the fallout, no matter how painful, rather than revert to the old pattern of running away. A week later, Jeffrey found himself standing outside Dr. Melissa Rivera's office, a single-story building near Westport's Central Park. The waiting room smelled of lavender and faintly of crayons, courtesy of the children's area in the corner. Sean sat stiffly in a chair, clutching a small notepad. Francis was by his side, rubbing his back in reassurance. Jeffrey had offered to attend every session, but Dr. Rivera recommended alternating individual and group visits. Today's appointment was for the three of them together. His nerves jangled. He'd spoken in front of hundreds of corporate investors without flinching. Yet the thought of delving into family matters under a therapist's watchful eye made his stomach tighten. Moments later, a door opened, revealing a woman in her late 30s with a welcoming smile. "Hi, Sean," she greeted, kneeling to his level. "You must be Francis and Jeffrey. I'm Dr. Rivera. Ready to come in?" Sean stared at his sneakers, nodding mutely. They followed Dr. Rivera into a softly lit room with cozy chairs arranged in a semicircle. She gestured for Sean to pick his seat first. Then Francis and Jeffrey settled on either side, forming a small triangle. "I know you've all been through a lot recently," Dr. Rivera began gently. "Today, I'd like to create a safe space for everyone to share their feelings. Sean, would you like to start by telling me one thing that's been on your mind?" Sean fidgeted. I found out Mr. Hill is actually my dad." He glanced quickly at Jeffrey, then away. "I felt confused. Like, why didn't he tell me sooner?" Jeffrey's chest constricted. He waited for Dr. Rivera's cue before speaking. "Sean, I didn't know you existed until I came back to Westport a few weeks ago, but I also blocked out all messages from your mum back then. I wish I could change that." Dr. Rivera nodded, turning to Francis. "Francis, how are you handling this new dynamic?" Francis drew a breath. "It's a mix of relief and fear. I've been raising Sean largely on my own, with support from my mom, of course. But now Jeffrey is here, wanting to step in. It's what I wanted for Sean, his father in his life, but I'm still scared he might leave again." Sean's eyes darted to his mother, then to Jeffrey. "You have to do work in New York a lot," the boy said, lips quivering. "What if you just don't come back?" The rawness of the question sliced through Jeffrey. He leaned forward. "I'm here to stay, no matter what. I might have to visit Manhattan sometimes for business. But Westport is my home now too. You're my son, and I'm not disappearing again." He paused, letting the words hang. "I promise." Dr. Rivera nodded. "Sean, do you believe him?" The child hesitated, then shrugged. "I want to," he whispered. "But I get scared." They spent the rest of the session talking about boundaries, trust, and how to handle Jeffrey's absences when he traveled for Hilltech. Dr. Rivera provided communication exercises, simple tasks like writing short notes to each other when he was away, and setting regular video calls for father and son. After the session, they walked out together under a soft drizzle. Sean, quieter than usual, clutched Francis's hand on one side and Jeffrey's on the other, a small sign of progress. When they reached Francis's car, she smiled tentatively at Jeffrey. "He did better than I expected. Thank you for being honest." He nodded. "I'm committed. I'll do whatever it takes." As Francis helped Sean into the back seat, Jeffrey caught the boy's eye and offered a quick smile. Sean returned a half smile, uncertainty mingled with hope. Over the next few days, Jeffrey's life in Westport shifted into a new rhythm. He worked out of the lake house, converting Uncle Edward's old study into a home office. Victoria coordinated schedules remotely, shipping documents and setting up video conferences so Jeffrey could manage Hilltech from afar. Some days, the arrangement ran smoothly. Others, it collapsed under the weight of pressing deadlines or investor anxiety. Still, Geoffrey found time to pick Sean up from school and share small routines: a weekly dinner at Francis's, weekend fishing trips on the lake, father-son tinkering sessions, building miniature structures with spare electronics. Each moment felt like a precious gift he was terrified of squandering. Even the townspeople began to soften, if only slightly. At the grocery store, neighbors who once glared at him now offered polite nods, seeing him accompany Sean or help Francis load bags into her trunk. The local bakery staff recognized him as Sean's dad, occasionally slipping an extra cookie into his order for the boy. In the evenings, after Sean was asleep, Francis would sometimes invite Geoffrey for tea on her porch, discussing parenting strategies and therapy homework. Their discussions were cautious but increasingly open, small smiles replacing the old bitterness that once lingered in every conversation. Sometimes, Margaret would join them, and while her demeanor remained stern, she showed a reluctant acceptance of Geoffrey's effort. One night, after Sean had gone to bed, Geoffrey lingered on Francis's porch steps longer than usual. She stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself to ward off the cool lake breeze. Their conversation meandered from Sean's progress to random childhood memories of Westport. For a fleeting moment, Geoffrey could almost feel a glimmer of the closeness they once shared. When he finally rose to leave, he mustered the courage to ask, "Do you think we could ever be more than co-parents again?" The question slipped out quietly, unbidden yet honest. Francis averted her gaze, lips parted in thought. "I don't know," she admitted, voice trembling slightly. "I'm still working through a lot of hurt, but I won't deny there's something different about you now. Time will tell." He nodded, accepting her answer. As he walked back to the lake house under the pale moonlight, he felt a tempered optimism. They were rebuilding, slowly, imperfectly, but after so many years of running, the prospect of reassembling his life here in Westport was both humbling and strangely liberating. For the first time, he sensed that the cracks in his life might be healing into something sturdier than he'd ever known before. By early summer, Geoffrey felt confident enough in his routine to introduce Sean to his other world, Manhattan. Although he still spent most of his time in Westport, a few pressing matters demanded his physical presence at Hiltech's headquarters. Surprisingly, Francis agreed to the weekend trip, seeing it as an opportunity for Sean to understand the part of Geoffrey's life he had once let overshadow everything. They took the train from New Haven to Grand Central, with Sean practically glued to the window, wide-eyed at the towering buildings that cropped up as they approached the city. Once inside the cavernous station, the boy's mouth dropped open. "It's huge," he breathed. Geoffrey grinned, remembering his own awe the first time he stepped into Manhattan as a teenager. "It is. And loud. Stick close. Okay?" Navigating the bustling crowds, Geoffrey kept a protective hand on Sean's shoulder, while Francis followed, scanning her surroundings with equal parts curiosity and tension. She'd been to the city before, of course, back when they were married, but never for anything more than fleeting visits. Their first stop was Hiltech's office skyscraper. The sleek, polished floors and glass walls were a stark contrast to Westport's cozy, small-town vibe. As soon as they stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor, Victoria Chang appeared, wearing a tailored suit and a rare smile. "You must be Sean," she greeted warmly, crouching to meet his gaze. "I've heard so much about you." Sean blinked. "Are you Dad's boss?" He still occasionally stumbled over the word Dad, but it came more naturally now since the big reveal. Victoria's eyes darted to Geoffrey in amusement. "Sometimes I think so," she teased, offering her hand for a handshake. "I'm Victoria, your dad's assistant." Sean shook her hand solemnly. Geoffrey led them on a brief tour, showing Sean the meeting rooms, the open-plan workstations, and finally his own corner office with sweeping views of the city. The boy pressed his nose to the glass, Everything looks so small down there, he murmured, amazed. Frances hung back, arms folded, her gaze wandering the office walls where Jeffrey's accolades and framed newspaper articles were displayed. He couldn't help noticing her fleeting expression, part admiration, part sadness at the distance this world had once created between them. The weekend moved quickly. Jeffrey took them to a tech expo where Hilltech was showcasing new products. Sean buzzed with excitement around the cutting-edge gadgets, asking endless questions that charmed the engineers. Frances, too, seemed cautiously impressed, watching Jeffrey interact with colleagues who lauded him for his vision. It was a side of him she hadn't seen since their early days, when he brimmed with big ideas before ambition hardened into obsession. But not all encounters were friendly. On Sunday morning, they visited a high-end cafe near the office. While waiting in line, Jeffrey spotted a rival tech entrepreneur, Graham Rutherford, who once tried to poach Hilltech's top developers. Graham approached with a smug grin. "Jeffrey Hill," he drawled, "I almost didn't recognize you. Heard you'd been playing father in some backwater town. Didn't think you had it in you." Jeffrey stiffened, the hackles rising along his neck. Sean was beside him, fiddling with a sugar packet, and Frances stood close, posture rigid. "I've been spending time with my family," Jeffrey replied, forcing a calm tone. Graham cast a mocking glance at Sean. "This must be the young genius I've heard rumors about." He crouched slightly, giving Sean a condescending pat on the shoulder. "Your dad here once nearly tanked his entire career to chase big dreams. Guess some things never change." Before Jeffrey could respond, Sean stepped back, clearly uncomfortable. Frances placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. Anger flashed in Jeffrey's eyes. He remembered the countless times he'd dismissed personal connections in pursuit of deals with men like Graham. Now, seeing the man's arrogance aimed at his son felt like a personal assault. "All the success in the world doesn't excuse rudeness, Graham," Jeffrey said, voice low. "You and I have different definitions of what matters. If you'll excuse us, my son and I were about to enjoy some coffee." He steered Frances and Sean away, leaving Graham behind with an insincere smirk. In the corner booth, Sean stared at Jeffrey. "Who was that guy?" "A competitor," Jeffrey answered, exhaling slowly. "Someone who values money over people." Sean tilted his head, regarding his father with those keen green eyes. "Was that how you used to be?" Frances looked at Jeffrey in surprise, waiting for his answer. He mustered a faint, wry smile. "Yes," he admitted, "a part of me was like that for a long time. I thought winning in business was everything." Sean studied his father's expression, then offered a small nod, as though weighing the honesty. "I'm glad you came back to Westport," he said, voice tentative but sincere. "I'd rather have you than a bunch of money." The simple statement made Jeffrey's throat tighten. "Me too," he murmured. "I'd rather have you." They finished their coffee, well, hot chocolate for Sean, in relative quiet, each of them processing the tension of that encounter. Later, as they headed back to the train station, Jeffrey caught Frances's eye. She reached out discreetly, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. The moment spoke volumes. She recognized how difficult it had been for him to stand up for family over pride. On the train ride home, Sean dozed again, lulled by the rhythmic clack of the tracks. Frances and Jeffrey talked in hushed tones, reflecting on the weekend's highs and lows. "He's proud of you," she observed softly. "You're showing him a side of yourself that proves change is possible." Jeffrey looked at Sean's sleeping form. In that small, upturned face, he saw both forgiveness and hope. Leaning back in the seat, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. Despite the confrontation with Graham, or maybe because of it, he felt more certain than ever that he'd made the right choice by letting fatherhood take precedence over unbridled ambition. Their worlds had indeed collided, but maybe, just maybe, something stronger would emerge from the impact. The bustle of summertime had taken hold of Westport, with locals and tourists meandering along the sidewalks in shorts and sandals. Yet Jeffrey hardly noticed the easy pace. His mind was consumed by the phone call he'd received that morning, one that threatened to upend everything he'd built since his return. He stood with Frances on her porch, gazing out at the flower beds she meticulously tended. The bright blooms contrasted sharply with the looming conversation. Inside, Sean played a board game with Margaret, oblivious for the moment. "It's a major opportunity," Jeffrey admitted. Hilltech could land a contract that might be the biggest in the company's history, government-level cybersecurity for multiple agencies, but it requires total commitment for at least 6 months. The project timeline is brutal. Frances crossed her arms, tension radiating from her posture. "Meaning you'd have to be in Manhattan more or less full-time, right?" He nodded. "Yes, I'd be expected to oversee the teams, meet daily with government liaisons. They want me personally because it's my name and reputation that got us this far." For a moment, the only sounds were the chirping birds and faint laughter from Sean inside. Frances closed her eyes, frustration and heartbreak mingling on her face. "I thought you were done with those all-or-nothing work deals." "So did I," he said, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "But this is unprecedented. If I turn it down, Hilltech could lose out. There's a competing bid from Rutherford Tech." He grimaced at the memory of Graham Rutherford's smug face. "He's already circling." Frances let out a slow exhale. "You need to decide what matters more, Jeffrey. I know you've changed, but can you really juggle a high-stakes contract like that and still be here for Sean?" His chest tightened with the weight of her question. "I don't want to abandon him, but if I secure this contract, financially, he'll never have to worry about anything. His future," Frances cut him off gently. "His future is more than money. He needs you to show up. We've come so far. Don't throw it away." Her words lingered as he went inside to find Sean. The boy was concentrating on moving plastic game pieces around a colorful board, Margaret observed from a chair, giving Jeffrey a wary look. "Everything all right out there?" He forced a smile. "Just discussing work." Sitting on the floor beside Sean, he ruffled the boy's hair. "How's the game going, champ?" Sean shrugged. "Grandma's winning, but I'm going to catch up." He didn't look up from the board, yet Jeffrey sensed the underlying tension. Sean had grown more intuitive about adult concerns lately. He probably picked up on the mood from the porch. Later that evening, Jeffrey returned to the lake house, where Victoria and Marcus were waiting by arrangement. They'd driven down from Manhattan together for a last-minute summit, bringing stacks of documents for his review. Marcus paced the living room, clearly on edge. "This government contract is massive," he began the moment Jeffrey walked in. "It's exactly the kind of high-profile deal we need to cement Hilltech's place at the top, but Rutherford's sniffing around. We have to move now." Victoria chimed in quietly. "The board wants immediate confirmation of your willingness to commit. They'll hold an emergency vote if they sense you're hesitating." Jeffrey pressed a hand to his forehead. "So it's all or nothing again. I either commit to months in Manhattan or risk losing everything." "Pretty much," Marcus said flatly. A heavy silence took over the room. The three stood in a triangle of unspoken tensions. Marcus, desperate to secure the deal. Victoria, torn between loyalty to Jeffrey and the demands of the company, and Jeffrey, straddling the line between fatherhood and business. Finally, Jeffrey exhaled. "I need some time to think." Marcus's eyes flashed with frustration. "We don't have time. The agency wants an answer by next week." Jeffrey clenched his jaw, nodding in acknowledgement. With that, Marcus and Victoria took their leave, leaving the documents stacked on the dining table. The door clicked shut behind them, echoing in the silent house. For hours, Jeffrey paced the living room, mind spinning. He thought of all the progress he'd made with Sean, family therapy sessions, weekends at the lake, the child's cautious but growing trust. He envisioned the heartbreak if he announced he'd be mostly gone for the next 6 months, returning only sporadically. Yet he also remembered the shame of failure 6 years ago, the humiliation of bankruptcy, and how he promised himself he'd never let Hilltech slip through his fingers. Eventually, he stepped out onto the dock, the moonlight shimmering across the water. In the quiet hush, he found himself speaking aloud, as if Uncle Edward was still around to hear. "I don't know what to do. If I give up Hilltech, I lose everything I worked for, but if I don't, I lose Sean." The gentle lapping of the lake gave no answer. Still, in that silence, something within him began to crystallize. He had walked away from Westport once before, chasing success and leaving devastation behind. This time, the stakes were even higher, Sean's well-being, not just Francis's heart. By the time dawn's first glow appeared over the treetops, Jeffrey remained on the dock, the decision nearly formed in his mind. He sensed the heartbreak it would cause for Marcus, for the board, and maybe even for himself. But the alternative, hurting Sean yet again, seemed unbearable. His phone vibrated with a new message from Marcus. "We need your decision in 48 hours. Rising stiffly, Jeffrey stared at the reflection of the dawn sky on the water. He imagined Sean's small hand clasped in his, the boy's eyes shining when he showed off a new invention or reeled in his first fish. In that reflection, he didn't see the silhouette of a ruthless CEO. He saw a father, and that simple recognition lit a spark in his chest he couldn't extinguish. Shaking off the nighttime chill, he turned back toward the house. 2 days, 48 hours to finalize the path that would define his future and Sean's. This was the ultimate test, and he knew deep down that no matter how painful the choice, family had to come first. Because losing Hilltech would sting, but losing Sean would break him forever. The sun rose gently over Westport's lake, gilding the water in pale gold as Jeffrey walked down the dock. He had spent a sleepless night reflecting on the choice that could forever define the life he shared with Sean. The crisp air soothed his nerves, a far cry from the claustrophobic tension of Manhattan's skyscrapers. Each step on the worn planks felt like a vow, to himself, to his son, to the people he'd once abandoned. He paused at the dock's end, gazing at the reflection of the clouds. Somewhere in that mirror image, he saw shades of his younger self, ambitious, afraid, running headlong from any vulnerability. Then, he recalled the phone call from Marcus, 48 hours, to decide whether to commit to a 6-month government contract or let it slip away and risk Hilltech's future. The pull of professional triumph warred with the promise he had made to Sean. By the time Jeffrey headed back to the lake house, the morning sky had brightened. He found Francis in the kitchen, sipping coffee. She'd arrived earlier to check on him, perhaps guessing how raw his emotions would be. Outside, he could hear Sean's voice as he and Margaret fed breadcrumbs to the ducks by the shore. Francis offered a small smile. "Did you sleep at all?" He shook his head, pouring himself coffee. "Not really. I've been thinking about what I'm going to say to Marcus and the board." She set her mug down with a gentle clink. "I know how much Hilltech means to you." "Just don't forget what you mean to Sean." Jeffrey reached across the counter, giving her hand a grateful squeeze. In that moment, any lingering anger she'd held seemed to soften into concern. "No matter what happens with the company," he said softly, "I'll choose him." A short while later, Marcus's sedan crunched up the gravel driveway. Victoria followed in a separate car. Their arrival sent a jolt of anxiety through Jeffrey, but also a flicker of resolve. He led them into Uncle Edward's old study, now Jeffrey's makeshift office. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor as Marcus snapped open his briefcase, launching into a spiel about the contract's high stakes. This is a once-in-a-lifetime deal, Marcus insisted, voice taut. If we can lock in these government contracts, Hill Tech becomes unstoppable. But we need you in Manhattan, full-time, for the next 6 months, minimum. Victoria nodded, her tone more measured. The board is backing you, but only if you lead the charge personally. Otherwise, Rutherford Tech is poised to grab the contract. Jeffrey inhaled, letting the gravity of their words settle. He looked at Marcus, at Victoria, two people who had stood by him through the company's lean early years. He thought of the times he had sacrificed everything, including his marriage, to keep Hill Tech afloat. But now, he pictured Sean's scared eyes on the dock that morning he ran away. I appreciate everything Hill Tech has given me, Jeffrey said quietly. We built something remarkable. But my son needs me here, not just in name, but physically present and involved. I'm not prepared to vanish into Manhattan for half a year and risk losing him. Marcus's jaw tightened. So, you're passing on the contract. Are you walking away? Jeffrey forced himself to stay calm. I'm prepared to sell my majority stake to you or to the existing board. On one condition, Hill Tech remains stable. You continue our current direction and keep our employees secure. I'll stay on as an advisor, maybe a minority shareholder. But I cannot lead a 6-month intensive project that uproots everything I've rebuilt with my family. A stunned silence filled the study. Victoria's eyes widened. She looked torn between admiration and dismay. Marcus, on the other hand, looked almost betrayed. You're serious, Jeffrey nodded, swallowing hard. I am. But you've spent your whole life growing this company, Marcus pressed, voice cracking at the edges. If you step back now, you'll lose direct control. Are you truly okay with that? Meeting his friend's gaze, Jeffrey considered how to encapsulate everything he'd learned in Westport. It's not about being okay or not. It's about what matters more. 6 years ago, I prioritized business over everything, and it cost me my marriage, my self-respect, and nearly my relationship with my own child. I won't make that mistake again. Victoria let out a shaky breath, her eyes glimmering with unshed tears. Hill Tech it might never be the same without you, Jeffrey. I know, he murmured, but it'll survive. And so will I. With that, he rose from his chair, the conversation sealed by the resolute set of his shoulders. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, then gave a curt nod, hands shaking slightly as he snapped the briefcase shut. We'll handle the legalities, he said quietly. If that's your final decision. It is. Victoria lingered a moment, searching Jeffrey's face. I'll stay with Hill Tech in whatever capacity is needed, but if you ever want me to join your new venture, or if you need anything else, please call. Jeffrey offered a grateful smile. Thank you. I might just take you up on that. Minutes later, Marcus and Victoria departed, leaving Jeffrey alone in the silent study. A swirl of emotions churned in his chest, fear, regret, a twinge of loss. Yet overshadowing all of that was a curious sense of freedom, like a knot in his soul had finally loosened. He looked at the dusty shelves where Uncle Edward's fishing trophies once sat, recalling how the old man believed success came from the heart, not just the wallet. A knock on the doorframe made him turn. Sean stood there, hesitant, hands in his pockets. Were those your business friends? He asked in a small voice. Jeffrey nodded, kneeling to meet Sean's gaze. Yes. They wanted me to work in the city for a long time, but I told them I can't leave you. Sean's eyes flickered with a mix of confusion and gratitude. You didn't want to go. No, Jeffrey said softly. I want to stay right here with you. We'll figure everything else out together. For the first time, Sean smiled fully, an unguarded, radiant grin that lit up the old study. He threw his arms around Jeffrey's neck, hugging him fiercely. Jeffrey closed his eyes, feeling Sean's heartbeat against his own. Thank you, the boy whispered, voice muffled by Jeffrey's shoulder. Geoffrey swallowed the lump in his throat, returning the embrace. In the golden light streaming through the window, father and son sealed a promise far more valuable than any contract, a pledge of presence, of building a life where family came first. Though the future was uncertain, in that moment they stood on new foundations, ones that, this time, Geoffrey vowed never to abandon. 3 months later, the leaves began turning crimson and gold around Westport. The once hot summer days gave way to cooler breezes, and Sean's laughter echoed around the lake house's yard as he raked fallen leaves into enormous piles. The air seemed lighter now that Geoffrey had officially stepped back from Hill Tech. Freed from the non-stop corporate grind, he focused on forging deeper connections with Sean and navigating the evolving relationship with Francis. Though the sale of his majority stake was still working its way through endless legal loops, Geoffrey felt unexpectedly at peace. He had enough financial security to explore new ventures, but for the first time in his life, money and status weren't his driving forces. Instead, he embraced mornings spent helping Sean with homework, afternoons visiting Dr. Rivera for ongoing therapy, and evenings cooking simple dinners with Francis or reading on the porch. They continued the counseling sessions, sometimes together and sometimes individually. Dr. Rivera's soft-lit office had become a familiar haven where past wounds were carefully unearthed and addressed. Sean, less guarded now, openly shared his fears that his dad might vanish again, that he wasn't good enough to keep him around. Each confession broke Geoffrey's heart, but he welcomed the honesty, determined to demonstrate consistency and love. One crisp Thursday morning, Geoffrey headed to a small co-working space on Main Street, a modest setup with a handful of locals tapping away at laptops. He'd rented a desk to develop his own tech consultancy, a small operation focusing on ethically guided innovations. In the back of his mind, he heard Uncle Edward's raspy chuckle, imagining how proud he'd be to see Geoffrey building something that wouldn't swallow him whole. David Mercer, an old friend from high school who had become a local real estate broker, stopped by with coffee. "This is quite a pivot," David remarked, handing Geoffrey the steaming cup. "A few years ago, you were the rising titan in Manhattan. Now you're setting up shop in Westport." Geoffrey shrugged, sipping the coffee. "Life's full of surprises. I think I'm exactly where I should be." David clapped him on the shoulder. "Glad to hear it, man. And by the way, folks around town are talking less about your disappearance and more about how you're stepping up as Sean's dad. They see you putting in the time." The compliment warmed Geoffrey more than he cared to admit. He'd never put stock in small-town chatter before, but now the gradual shift in perception felt like a validation of his choices. Later that evening, Geoffrey found himself sitting at Francis's kitchen table, scanning a local newspaper article about a scholarship fund he'd recently established in Uncle Edward's name. The scholarship aimed to support Westport High School seniors pursuing STEM fields. Sean sat beside him, doodling in a spiral notebook. Margaret hovered near the stove, stirring a pot of stew and occasionally glancing at them. Although her gaze carried remnants of skepticism, she no longer wore that hard shield of disapproval. The woman who once threatened to keep Geoffrey out of Sean's life now saw evidence of his transformation daily. Francis entered from the living room, drying her hands on a dish towel. "Dinner's almost ready," she announced, smiling when she noticed Geoffrey flipping through the article. "I saw the piece about the Edward Hill scholarship. Nice photo, too." He nodded, showing the page to Sean. "I'm proud of this. We'll help students who might not have the resources to chase big dreams." Sean's eyes lit up. "Could I apply one day if I study engineering? Or—" "Is that cheating?" Geoffrey chuckled, tousling Sean's hair. "I'll make sure you earn it fair and square." He paused, feeling a pang of sadness that Uncle Edward never got to see this. "Edward would have loved to see you excel in science." Margaret turned from the stove, an uncharacteristic softness in her expression. Edward knew Sean was special. He'd be proud you're trying to guide him. Geoffrey. A quiet hush settled in the kitchen as they all processed that moment. The atmosphere was warm, domestic, almost achingly normal. Dinner passed with easy conversation. Sean recounted a new invention idea for a treehouse pulley system, while Frances teased Geoffrey about his attempts to replicate her mother's stew recipe. Margaret pitched in with well-placed criticisms that, in their own way, felt oddly affectionate. After the dishes were cleared, they lingered at the table, sipping tea. Frances caught Geoffrey's eye, a question glimmering there. "Do you have a minute to talk?" she asked quietly, nodding toward the porch. Sean was busy testing an idea for his pulley system in the living room, so Margaret waved them off with a grunt of acquiescence. Outside, the air was cool, the sky brushed with faint stars. Frances hugged her arms against the chill. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she began slowly. "Boston University called. They renewed that job offer I once considered. It would be part-time initially, mostly remote. I could commute once a week at most. They know I have a child." Geoffrey's heart skipped. He recalled the earlier mention of Boston, how it threatened to complicate co-parenting. That's a big opportunity." She nodded. "I've always wanted to teach at the collegiate level, but I also don't want to uproot Sean. He's finally settling into a routine with you here." He exhaled, studying her face under the porch light. "If you want to take it, we'll figure out a schedule. I can handle things with Sean when you need to be away. We're co-parents. More than that, we're friends. I support your dreams too." Her eyes misted with gratitude. "Thank you. I haven't accepted yet, but I appreciate knowing you'd help." They stood for a moment in companionable silence, the memory of their broken past overshadowed by the reality of the present, a team building a circle of healing around Sean. As the night air grew colder, they returned inside to find Sean showing Margaret his sketches for the treehouse pulley, the older woman nodding with a surprising grin of pride. Geoffrey lingered in the doorway, taking in the scene. Frances pouring hot cocoa, Margaret offering suggestions about rope thickness, Sean eagerly explaining his design. He realized it wasn't just therapy or good intentions that healed wounds. It was the everyday commitment to show up for one another. Healing circles, Dr. Rivera had called them, a process of repeated honesty, support, and vulnerability. Each conversation, each moment of trust, knitted their family closer together, and Geoffrey, watching his son's animated face, felt more certain than ever that the new foundation they'd laid was strong enough to last. Late autumn arrived in Westport, and with it came the annual community festival, a celebration of harvest, history, and the small-town bonds that had always run deeper than Geoffrey once realized. Brightly colored banners fluttered along Main Street. Local artisans sold crafts from makeshift stalls, and the aroma of fresh cider and roasted nuts perfumed the crisp air. It was a far cry from the sterile galas and corporate events Geoffrey had once frequented in Manhattan. He strolled through the festival with Frances and Sean at his side, pausing to admire wooden ornaments and homemade quilts. Townsfolk who previously wore skeptical frowns now gave nods of approval or brief, friendly hellos. Some even struck up conversation about the scholarship fund or asked about Sean's science projects. Through these small gestures, Geoffrey felt the last remnants of his outsider status melting away. As they passed the Historical Society's booth, Frances let out a surprised laugh. "Oh my goodness," she said, pointing at a photo display. "That's our old wedding venue." "Remember," Geoffrey followed her gaze. A framed photograph showed the local chapel's white steeple surrounded by autumn leaves, just as it had been on their wedding day. His chest tightened at the memory, both joyous and painful. He hadn't seen that chapel in years, avoiding it like all relics of the past. Yet here it stood in a photo, as though gently reminding him of promises made and broken. Sean tugged on Francis's sleeve. "You and Dad got married there." He still stumbled over calling Jeffrey Dad, but the word came more naturally now. A new acceptance blossomed with each day. Francis hesitated, glancing at Jeffrey. "Yes, we did, a long time ago." Sean tilted his head, curiosity brimming in his eyes. "Why did you stop being married?" A soft flush spread across Francis's cheeks. She found Jeffrey's gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. It was a question they'd skirted around with Sean, focusing on the present instead, but they couldn't protect him from the truth forever. Jeffrey knelt to face his son, speaking in a low, steady voice. "Your mom and I were very young. We loved each other but had a lot of problems. I made mistakes. I left town without working to fix them." Francis nodded, adding gently, "But we never stopped caring about each other, or about you, Sean. That's the important part." The boy frowned, absorbing this. "Okay," he said at last, though he still seemed perplexed. He eyed the chapel photo a moment longer before letting the subject drop. They continued wandering through the festival, sampling apple pie at one stand, hot cider at another. Sean ran ahead to watch a juggling performance, enthralled by the bright balls looping in the air. Francis and Jeffrey meandered more slowly, comfortable in each other's company. Eventually, they found themselves by a makeshift dance floor under twinkling string lights, where a local band played gentle folk tunes. Couples swayed to the rhythm, smiling and whispering under the dusky sky. Sean was still preoccupied, searching for friends among the crowd of children near the funnel cake stall. Francis paused, watching the dancers. "We never danced at festivals like this," she murmured, half to herself. "Too busy, I guess." Jeffrey inhaled the cool night air, his gaze drifting over the couples. "I was always rushing somewhere back then." She nodded. "Do you regret it? Leaving, I mean." He turned to her, heart constricting. "Every day. But if I'd stayed who I was, I might never have changed. I can't rewrite the past, but I'd like to create a better future." A hush fell between them. Then, tentatively, Jeffrey extended his hand, offering a gentle smile. "Would you like to dance?" Francis hesitated only a moment before slipping her hand into his. The band's melody guided them to the edge of the dance floor. They moved awkwardly at first, rediscovering a closeness neither had felt for years. But soon, the music flowed through them, and they found a slow, comfortable rhythm. Under the glow of the festival lights, the distance that once yawned between them seemed to shrink. Their shared history, both painful and precious, wove through each step. Every swirl of her dress, every press of his palm against her waist felt like a long-delayed conversation, an unspoken apology for what was lost, and a promise of what might be regained. After the song ended, Francis rested her head briefly on Jeffrey's shoulder, exhaling a shaky breath. I never stopped caring about you," she admitted softly, "even when I was furious. I thought I hated you at times, but it was mostly heartbreak." Jeffrey touched her cheek, the moment tender and raw. "I didn't deserve your love, yet you gave it anyway. I'm sorry I ever took it for granted." She drew back, searching his eyes. The flickering festival lights reflected in her gaze. "I believe you now," she said, voice trembling. "I believe you're trying to do better." A child's voice interrupted them. Sean, waving from the edge of the crowd. "Mom, Dad!" "They're doing fireworks." They exchanged smiles, hands lingering together for a fraction longer before walking over to join him. Settling on a bench, they watched vibrant bursts of color illuminate the night sky. Each explosion echoed through Jeffrey's chest like a promise. He could sense the circle closing, the distance bridged by forgiveness. While the future remained unwritten, the present moment shone brightly with possibilities. As the final burst of fireworks rained shimmering sparks overhead, Jeffrey glanced at Francis and Sean, feeling something he hadn't experienced in years: pure contentment. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they faced them together now, bound by a renewed understanding and a hope that transcended old hurts. And in that full-circle moment, standing in the very town he'd fled so long ago, Jeffrey Hill realized he was finally, truly home. 1 year after Jeffrey's return to Westport, the autumn chill had begun to yield to the gentler days of early winter. A thin layer of frost sparkled across the lawn as friends and family gathered at the lake house to celebrate Sean's 7th birthday. Streamers and balloons bobbed in the light breeze, and the aroma of hot cocoa wafted from a makeshift drink station on the porch. Jeffrey surveyed the preparations, heart drumming with a mixture of excitement and gratitude. The yard felt alive with laughter, neighbors chatting by the grill, kids running about, and a small group of Sean's classmates chasing each other across the lawn. Francis was inside, placing the finishing touches on a homemade cake shaped like a rocket ship, an homage to Sean's fascination with invention and exploration. He spotted Margaret near the food table, methodically organizing plates and cutlery. Her gaze caught his, and she offered a nod of acknowledgement. In the past, her eyes brimmed with disapproval. Today, he saw guarded respect, an unspoken acceptance that Jeffrey had proven his commitment over the past months. James Peterson arrived with a wrapped box under one arm, greeting Francis politely in the kitchen. Though once a rival for her affections in Jeffrey's mind, James had become something of a friend, especially after seeing the devotion Jeffrey showed Sean. They exchanged waves, a silent reminder that forging new relationships sometimes required letting go of old resentments. Sean dashed up to Jeffrey, breathless, wearing a homemade cardboard inventor's badge pinned to his shirt. "Dad!" he exclaimed, still testing the word with a blend of pride and familiarity. "Come see what Tyler and I built." He pulled Jeffrey over to a rickety but imaginative structure of wooden planks and ropes near the edge of the yard, a scaled-down model of a treehouse pulley system they'd envisioned. Tyler stood proudly by, beaming. Jeffrey knelt, inspecting the contraption. "You did this all by yourselves?" Sean nodded eagerly. "Mostly. Mom helped cut the wood, but we measured everything, just like you showed me." A wave of paternal pride welled in Jeffrey's chest. "This is awesome, champ. Let's show everyone after the cake." Sean grinned, then ran off, calling Tyler to join him in chasing a soccer ball. Jeffrey stood with a smile lingering on his face. Each time Sean called him Dad, it felt like both a gift and a reminder that he was finally where he belonged. Before long, Francis appeared on the porch, carrying the rocket ship cake with careful, deliberate steps. Conversations hushed, and children scrambled to gather around the table. Sean bounced with excitement, eyes wide as he took in the cake's intricate frosting details. Stars, tiny fondant tools, and a chocolate engine at the rear. "Happy birthday, Sean!" Francis announced, setting the cake down. Everyone burst into applause and cheers. Sean laughed, cheeks flushing with happiness. At Jeffrey's nod, everyone launched into a spirited rendition of Happy Birthday. As the final notes faded, Sean closed his eyes, whispering a wish before blowing out the candles with a determined puff. Cheers and clapping erupted. When the noise settled, he looked around at the crowd, from Tyler and his classmates to the adults who'd supported him in their own ways: James, Margaret, David Mercer, Dr. Rivera, and others. His gaze finally rested on Francis and Jeffrey. I'm really happy," he said, voice small but sincere. "Thank you, everyone." People lined up for slices of cake and chatted in small clusters. Jeffrey stood next to Francis, handing out paper plates. She nudged him gently. "I haven't seen him this excited in a while," she whispered, eyes shining with emotion. He nodded. "He deserves it." After a pause, he added, "So do we." She met his gaze, and in that silent exchange, all the heartbreak and growth they'd traversed simmered in the background. For months, they'd quietly been exploring a renewed closeness. Late-night talks, shared laughs over Sean's antics, even a few tentative dates that felt both familiar and entirely new. They weren't rushing, but they were learning to trust again. As the party wound down, guests drifted off with hugs and handshakes. Soon, only the close family remained. Margaret clearing the last plates, James offering to help fold the collapsible tables, and David taking a final group photo by the lake. Francis and Jeffrey wandered down to the water's edge, where Sean was launching a little toy boat, another father-son project they'd completed just last week. "It's floating," Sean crowed, carefully guiding it with a small stick. Jeffrey knelt beside him, the crisp wind tugging at his hair. Francis joined them, wrapping a scarf tighter around her neck. Together, they watched the boat bob and drift. In that quiet moment, a sense of completion washed over them, like the final puzzle piece clicking into place. "Hey, Mom, Dad," Sean asked, glancing between the two. "Since it's my birthday, can we do a family photo? Just the three of us?" Francis swallowed, touched. Jeffrey grinned, ruffling Sean's hair. "Of course, that's a great idea." They motioned to James, who quickly grabbed a camera. The three lined up at the shore, Sean in the middle, clutching both parents' hands. The lake shimmered behind them under the late afternoon sun. As James counted down, Jeffrey felt a wave of gratitude for second chances, for the grace that allowed him to reclaim what he nearly lost. The camera's shutter clicked, freezing the moment in time. Later, after the guests had gone and Margaret retired for the night, Francis and Jeffrey sat on the porch swing, a soft blanket draped over their laps. Sean had fallen asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement. The moonlight cast gentle shadows on the porch. "It was a good day," Francis murmured. "Seeing him happy, it's everything." Jeffrey exhaled, gaze drifting to the sleeping silhouette visible through the window. "It really is." He paused, then turned to her, heart pounding. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a while. I'm ready for whatever comes next, with Sean and with us, if you are." Francis studied his face under the moonlight, a tender smile curving her lips. "I am," she whispered, placing her hand over his. "I never thought we'd get back here, but it feels right." Gently, he leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. The hush of the lake and the quiet hum of cicadas wove a lullaby around them. In that closeness, forgiveness and love mingled, forging a bond stronger than any vow they had made in their youth. This time, it was tempered by trials and a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. They sat like that for a long while, hand in hand, the weight of the past giving way to the promise of tomorrow. And as the moon rose higher, illuminating the lake's surface in silver ripples, Jeffrey Hill closed his eyes, overcome with a peace he had never known before. He had come home, not to a place, but to the hearts of those who trusted him again. It was a redemption more meaningful than any corporate victory, a triumph written in the unwavering love of a child's eyes and the enduring hope of a woman who had once believed in him, even when he'd lost all faith in himself. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.